Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 80th Conference of the Arkansas Historical Association. We are excited that you're here. Enjoy the show.
Good morning. I'm Rachel Patton.
And I'm Kathy Anderson.
And we want to welcome you to our 80th annual conference. This is the association's first virtual conference, and our moderators and presenters are all geared up to put on a great program. But still, we'll miss visiting with our friends in person, socializing at receptions, and touring historic sites. Over the years, we've had a lot of fun at our conferences, and our plan is to recreate an experience that will remind you of the good old days. Before Kathy and I tell you how to become a member of the AHA, let's take a walk down memory lane. Pay close attention. You just may see yourself on screen. Enjoy.
You're right, Rachel. Our conferences are so much fun. And although we're being safe and doing this virtually, we have put together a great conference.
Absolutely. This conference is filled with great presenters, amazing keynote speakers, awards, and much more.
If you are not a member of the Arkansas Historical Association, please consider joining. At only $20 a year, you can become a member and receive the Arkansas Historical Quarterly.
We want to thank everyone for attending the conference and hope you really enjoy it.
Welcome, everyone. What a great introduction from our leadership team. I'm Dr. Rebecca Howard, Becky, to my Arkansas history friends, of course, and I will be your moderator for the afternoon. I'm so excited to finally be back to talk about some American history, even if it's just in this virtual environment. So let me first tell you how things are going to go today. Similar to how we do it in the live conferences, we're going to have 3 sessions of presenters who speak for 10 to 15 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. To the right of your screen, you'll be able to see some icons there that can make your experience as normal as possible. The little speaker box is the event chat, and I can see that a few of you have already been using that. That's where you can make comments like, what a great presentation, or say hello to each other. And then at the bottom, there's a Q&A box, and those are for questions for the speakers specifically. So if you want to know a little bit more information about what one of the presenters said, then that's the place to submit the question, and then we'll include it in the question and answer session if we get to all of them at the end of every hour. If you have technical difficulties, please refer to the email that you received. We don't want you to lose the broadcast here. So our first speaker today, we're going to jump right into our speakers. Our first speaker today is Dr. Gary William Jones. He's a Jonesboro, Arkansas native and a veteran filmmaker who earned a master's degree in television from the University of Illinois and a PhD in heritage studies from Arkansas State. He is currently an executive producer of the web-based Arkansas Travel and Arkansas History channels. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jones.
Thanks, Rebecca. Good afternoon from Little Rock. From the KAIT A-State News Film Collection, stay tuned for archival footage of Arkansas native Johnny Cash and of the 1976 bicentennial 4th of July parade in Corning. Let's take a look. The KAIT A-State News Film Collection was introduced 2 years ago at the 78th Annual AHA Conference in Stuttgart. Today's brief follow-up presentation features 2 examples of how additional research can provide depth and context to archival moving images. KAIT TV in Jonesboro, Arkansas first began transmitting regular programming on Monday, July 15, 1963. During the 1970s and 1980s, before personal camcorders and the later ubiquity of smartphone videos and internet distribution, KAIT's news film cameras provided virtually the only public image records of Northeast Arkansas history, heritage, culture, and politics. Decades later, some of this priceless discarded news film is just beginning to be used in scholarly research. The KAIT A-State News Film Collection is a repository of 206 reels of 16mm news film covering over 6,000 stories, which aired on KAIT between 1972 and 1980. This represents almost 122 hours of running time, averaging an estimated 1 minute 13 seconds per story, with almost all content dealing with Northeast Arkansas. The collection offers not only regional significance, but also context for Arkansas politics, economic contributions, especially in agriculture, and sociological perspectives on national issues. During this era, while KAIT's 6 and 10 o'clock newscasts enjoyed one of the highest ratings of any U.S. television station, the Channel 8 local news served as a primary source of a collective memory in Northeast Arkansas. Because KAIT serves such a mostly rural and small town area, the station's newscasts often had some of the highest ratings in the United States. That was because television ratings are expressed as a percentage of the potential TV audience viewing at a given time. A KAIT news film clip from the March 20th, 1976 Johnny Cash homecoming concert in Rison, Arkansas, not only has built-in celebrity appeal, it provides an example of collective and community memory. The reaction shots of the locals provides much of the historical value of the footage. Kathy Miller, the original KAIT reporter on the story, provides additional context.
It was one of those picture-perfect stories that you never forget. Johnny Cash, accompanied by his wife June Carter, ride in on this silver bullet train. The sun rays were just bouncing off this train, giving it this shimmering effect. As the train pulls into Rison, Cash suddenly appears on the back of the train waving. Then he jumps onto a wagon, which carries him into town for a bicentennial parade. The streets are just lined with thousands of these admiring fans. The next stop was the park, where he leaps onto stage, grabs his guitar, and starts singing. It truly looked like a scene out of a Hollywood movie. It couldn't have been staged any better.
Hello, I'm Johnny Cash.
When we interviewed him later, he did comment that that was a very special day to him to return to Cleveland County where he grew up. Back then, there was none of the modern technology that there is today, including cell phones. A photographer and I left extremely early in the morning to drive across the state, get the story, and then we had to rush back to get the film developed. Back then, you're shooting 16mm film, which not only took time to develop, but it also took time to edit. Looking back, it's amazing how much news a small station like KAIT was able to produce, considering not only the challenges, but also logistics of getting some of these stories. It was a great job. I was just out of college, and I got to meet people from all walks of life, from presidential candidates to people struggling to put the next meal on the table. I feel my experiences at KEIT gave me insights that served me well throughout my career.
Another example of the power of television used to provide collective and community memory is a KEIT news film clip from the Corning, Arkansas Bicentennial July 4th Parade in 1976. By photographing the 2016 July 4th Parade in Corning from the same vantage points as the 1976 news film, and by conducting interviews with local informants, the KEIT collection preserves a poignant personal remembrance.
Our 4th of July picnic is a special time in Corning, and one of the things that we have done for as long as I can remember is have a homecoming parade. And that parade has floats from local residents. We have our high school band in it. Periodically, we have politicians from governors and senators down to local politicians that participate in the parade. It's just, as long as I can remember, we've had a parade, and as a child and as a teenager, I watched the parade. I've even been in the parade. One year I rode a float dressed as George Washington. And it's always something people are excited to see. They line the streets at 9 o'clock on the morning of the 4th, and the parade goes through town. It starts in downtown Corning and ends up out at our park where we have our 4th of July homecoming. And it's just something people get excited about, and people enjoy seeing what Corning has to offer as far as being patriotic on this special holiday. One of the special things that I saw when I was looking at that video, that film from 1976, as it was panning the crowd at the parade, I saw my mom and dad. And the 4th of July was always special for them. They worked countless hours at the picnic, which made it kind of unique that they were actually at the parade, because like me, so many years, we never had time to watch that parade because we were already out at the park working, making preparations for that day. So it was kind of neat when we saw the crowd and there was my mom and dad, because they had taken time to actually stop and come and watch the parade. And it's really a little more special because my dad he passed away years ago, and my mom just passed away here in recent months. And they both loved Corning. They loved what we did at the 4th of July. And they instilled that in us. My siblings, none of them live here in Corning, but every year they come home for the 4th of July. They watch the parade, and then they spend the day working out in the park just like everybody else from Corning.
Collective remembrance is as old as human society itself, serving as an important source of social cohesion. Broadcast, cable, streaming, television in general, and local broadcast TV stations like KEIT TV Jonesboro in particular represent collective memory and provide important resources for academic analysis and exploration.
Thank you so much, Gary. It's great that we have such talents in Arkansas who are preserving unique bits of Arkansas history like that. Our next presenter is Heather McNamee. She's a full-time instructor in the Arkansas State University History Department, where she is also co-director of the Social Science Education Program. She is in her final year in the History PhD program at the University of Memphis. And she serves as a Next Generation Advisory Committee member on the Arkansas Humanities Council, where she produces the Arkansas History Podcast. Please join me in welcoming Ms. McNamee.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Rebecca. So as Rebecca said, I'm Heather McNamee, and I'm presenting Segregated Histories, the Pitfalls and Opportunities of County Histories. Before we get into what this presentation is, I feel the need to state explicitly what it is not. It is not a takedown of all county histories. It's not even a complete takedown of the two county histories that I'm talking about today. It's not diminishing the importance of county histories. It's not arguing that only those with PhDs in history should write local history. In fact, I believe that local history is often best told by local people, regardless of their graduate education. So that's what it isn't. So what is it? What am I doing here today? As many of us probably well know, local histories, especially county histories, are incredibly important. They have significant impact on historic preservation efforts. And for small communities in Arkansas, the county histories are often the singular narrative of that specific place across time. And so I think because county histories wield such tremendous power in doing these things like shaping historic preservation and shaping how people think about a specific place during a specific time, that's why we should revisit them. So county histories often neglect non-white and non-male voices. They often provide important information regarding early white male settlers to the county, but neglect otherwise non-privileged voices and experiences. And of course, these stories of important white men are important and are definitely part of a county's history. It's only a sliver of what should make up a more complete and full historical narrative. And so this presentation advocates for re-examining these established county histories to create more inclusive local narratives that incorporate women and non-white experiences and contributions. And so I'm from Jonesboro, and so my examination is going to center on two county histories of Craighead County. And I will use these works to illustrate some of what is wrong with them, but also how we can look at them to really advocate for more inclusive local and county histories. And then finally, I will also examine the opportunities for creating more diverse local histories as a necessary precursor to reconciliation in the present. Just a little bit of an introduction to the two county histories that I'm going to be talking about today. The first one is Harry Williams. The History of Craighead County, Arkansas, that he wrote was published in 1930. Williams was a Craighead County native, and in his preface, he actually states that his history was both fully comprehensive and authentic. And I want y'all to think about that. He believes that this history that he has compiled is a fully comprehensive and authentic history of Craighead County. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind as we continue our conversation today. And then 3 decades later, in order to commemorate the Craighead County Centennial Celebration, Charles Stuck wrote The Story of Craighead County. And he even admits in his preface that he relies heavily on Harry Williams's history, but he does provide a slimmer, more concise history of the county with a few additions of events that had happened since Williams had published his work 3 decades earlier. So both Williams and Stuck provide some problematic depictions of non-white people in both of their narratives. And starting with indigenous folks, Williams refers to indigenous people as lurking savages on page 80 when highlighting the hard life that white settlers had in coming to the region in those early years. And even 30 years later, Stuck continues some of these problematic depictions of indigenous people by describing them as a sick and pitiful condition. And he also inaccurately and somewhat racist describes their culture as something akin to a death cult on page 35. For African Americans, there's limited acknowledgement of them at all in either history, but in Williams, he uses the language of, quote, if a man had slaves, these were utilized, end quote. And clearly, this indicates that for Williams, enslaved people were property to be worked and nothing more. And then finally, I think that both of their reliance on Henry Allen deserves a little bit of a closer look. So Henry Allen was actually brought into Craighead County as an enslaved person in 1860, and Harry Williams knew Henry Allen. They were contemporaries. They knew each other, and Williams actually relies pretty heavily on Henry Allen as a source about early Jonesboro, mostly because Allen was still alive in the late 1920s as Harry Williams was putting together his Craighead County history. But I think it's very telling that Williams only uses Henry Allen for his knowledge about early white Jonesboro settlers. I also think it's very telling that he does not ask Henry Allen about his own experiences as an enslaved person, or his role in Jonesboro's Black community. And because Stuck then relied so heavily on Williams' work as his source, he provides a very similar narrative about Henry Allen that only uses Allen as a source about white Jonesboro instead of Henry Allen's experience as a Black man in Jonesboro's earliest decades. And so for me, I think about all the rich stories that we could have gained from Henry Allen's experiences as both an enslaved person and also as a member of the Black community in Craighead County, if Williams had just thought to ask him about his life as well. In addition to problematic portrayals of non-white people, there are also just some major exclusions in these local histories. And so while Williams somewhat arrogantly stated in his preface that his work was comprehensive and authentic, there are many local histories that are missing. For example, the Jewish community that had provided such a central economic and social part of early 20th century Jonesboro gets minimal attention in those histories. The county's incredibly active African American population is completely neglected. And with that, any acknowledgement of Black businesses, Black schools, Black civic organizations, and Black churches. And even white women are sometimes mentioned, but get only a cursory look. And so even this is most glaring to me in Charles Stuck's work published in 1960, when even a woman like Hattie Caraway gets minimal attention some 30 years after her historic time in the U.S. Senate. Almost all groups, even white ones, are treated as monoliths, as though all had the same experiences and perspectives. There's limited class analysis. And of course, there are the inaccurate characterizations about Indigenous people that I talked about a couple of slides ago. And I could go on, right? In addition to excluding these vibrant contributions of non-white, non-male folks, another glaring exemption is any acknowledgement of class or racial conflict in these works. For the sake of painting a glorified image of local history, conflict is minimized. Events like night riding and whitecapping, which were very prevalent in Craighead County and had both class and racial origins, have minimal, if any, attention. The lynchings of Black men and women, such as the 1881 lynching of 4 Black men, Giles Peck, Green Harris, John Woods, and Bert Hoskins, just north of Jonesboro, are treated as necessary finales to breaking the racial status quo. Excluding these conflicts paints a not only distorted, but actually inaccurate historical narrative that minimizes the fights for humanity and democracy that these groups engaged in these local spaces across time. Maybe some of you are like, well, that sounds really negative. This whole presentation is not negative, I promise. So all of these are opportunities, right? So we look at these county histories as a template and sort of figure out where can we go from here. And I'm definitely not an expert, but I have spent a lot of time looking at these county histories and have some ideas of some ways that we could advance and attempt to create more inclusive county historical narratives. I think county historical journals can actually be a really great resource for adding more diverse histories. Those county historical journals are basically addendums to these established county histories. And some of the county historical journals across the state are already doing that and incorporating, non-white, non-male, non-landowning, non-straight voices, experiences, and perspectives. And I applaud those that are doing that. I think that as members of our county historical societies, we need to be looking around in our meetings and see who is missing. And not just acknowledge, okay, what voices and what perspectives are maybe missing from our meetings, but also then try to actively recruit non-white and non-male and non-straight members to these county historical societies, since those groups of people maybe have a different perspective and different experiences in our communities than we do. I also think it's important that we have open and honest conversations about the limitations of these early county histories. We can't just continue to view them as the be-all, end-all of county history. We need to ensure that we are critically examining our sources. We need to acknowledge that just as these county histories have bias, newspapers, magazines, and all the sources that we look at have bias as well. And speaking of bias, I think that sort of a call to action for all of us, including myself, is just acknowledging that we have our own biases and we have our own perspectives. And I think that that can go a long way too. Williams and Stuck privileged white male stories because they were white men. And so having some self-awareness and acknowledging our own biases can help ensure that we acknowledge the experiences of those who are not just like us. And then finally, sort of bringing it back into the conference theme, one of the themes of this conference is reconciliation. And coming to terms with our past has to happen before we can reconcile in the present. As long as the stories of a few are privileged over others, this reconciliation cannot happen. If you go to the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission website, one of the central action items is that they want to enable South Africans to come to terms with their past to advance the cause of reconciliation. It's no mistake that coming to terms with the past is a necessary precursor to this reconciliation. For us to do this in the United States, I think these exclusionary local narratives have to be revisited. Creating historical narratives that acknowledge the experiences and perspectives of all groups and also provide honest narratives concerning conflict in the past is a necessary first step toward potential reconciliation in the present. And finally, Charles Stuck actually stated that his county history was the story of people playing a part in the great democratic experiment that is called the United States of America. He concluded that local histories provide the, quote, pulse of our people, end quote. Adding the stories of local people who actively fought and continue to fight for equal access to democratic institutions is imperative. It is these people who are the true heartbeat of our collective human body. And finally, here's my contact information. Thank you so much. And if you have any questions or need to contact me for any reason, there's my email address. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heather. That was great. And we always need more voices and viewpoints exploring Arkansas history, especially at the local level. We've got a really rich background here in our state. So thank you for that. I'd like to remind everyone that you have the option to send questions to the presenters. And after this next presenter, we will have our Q&A session before we have a bit of a break, a 5-minute break before the next set of presenters. So that's that Q&A box down there at the bottom. And our next and final presenter for this session is Dr. Fatma Mukhtar May. She is the Archival Manager for the Northeast Arkansas Regional Archives, a branch of the Arkansas State Archives. She holds master's degrees in history and library science and a doctorate in heritage studies from Arkansas State University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mukhtar May.
Thank you, Rebecca. I hope you can hear me. Thank you for the kind presentation. And thank you for my two co-presenters for such wonderful presentations ahead of me. I will be talking about tracing narratives of slavery and reconciliation in nearest court records. And for some of you may know that NERA houses the Lawrence County court records, the earliest of which dates back to 1814. And a lot of them regard a very important issue for me, slavery. And I have selected several case studies or several groups of several court cases to present here today that exemplify suffering and also exemplify how people from different races cooperated with hope to create a sense of reconciliation in today's narrative of slavery and its remembrance. I will talk about 4 particular cases about Austin the slave, who was sued for murder and sentenced to death in the 1850s, about Jacob, who was so desperate that he drowned, preferred to die in the river rather than endure his fate. Also about 2 white men who were slave owners, John S. Moore and Peter Halderman, who freed their slaves and who made everything possible to aid them, including one of them by leaving Arkansas before the Civil War. So this is the first slide is the indictment of Austin, a slave who was a slave in Lawrence County. And this is the jury who said issued this indictment. We, the jury, do find the defendant guilty of murder in the manner and form as charged in the indictment. Samuel Jones, a regular man from Lawrence County, was the foreman of the jury. And here is the story. Excuse the text. It's just on one side you will see the paper, an image of the actual document. On the other side you will see a transcription of the document. So the story happened in August 1853 when Austin presumably talked improperly to his master, Benjamin Watson. What that impropriety was, we don't know, but it could have been just a slight raise of Austin's voice or something he didn't want to do, or any minor any minor tone of voice that would be considered improper could have been could have precipitated what was to happen. So Austin, in front of other people, talked improperly to his master. I don't know what was said. Documents don't record. But the master Watson, along with some of his white friends, decided that he would discipline Austin, meaning that he would probably flog him and whip him or whatever they were attempting to do, or simply beat him. And so when he went home, Austin told his wife, apparently he was married to another slave woman and that was living on the same property for the same slave master, that he would not allow anyone to whip him, because for him that would be probably it would not be. I'm sorry. So he was determined not to let anyone beat him and humiliate him. That would be humiliating for him. However, he didn't know what to do. He didn't know whether to flee, and he probably thought about fleeing. But then, if he got caught, he would most certainly be sold or even executed. So on the next day, he went about his business again, and but bundled some of his clothes and put them away, and which gave impression to other people and to those who were following him that he was getting ready to flee and run away, and probably that's what he thought of doing as a last resort. But Watson and his posse made it abundantly clear that that day or that night they would whip him, and whip him very hard, maybe beat him to death, I don't know. And he was prepared for it. So upon coming from the fields with some hoop poles, apparently 10 pieces of wood that were used to, well, I don't really know what they were used for, but this one witness who worked for Watson, the master, sent Austin to collect hoop poles from the forest. And so Austin was returning from the forest, from the woods, with hoop poles and an axe in his hand when he was accosted by Watson and 2 or 3 other white men. One of those men were Hiram Payne. Hiram Payne was really, really intent on correcting Austin. So Austin was caught off guard. He was holding his axe. He was directed to lay down the axe, but he refused to do so because he expected to be beaten, expected to be attacked. He was keeping to himself, kept walking. The man followed. Hiram Payne decided that he would not wait any longer, so he walked behind Austin with a plank. He drew his stick upon Austin, but Austin warded off the blow with his left arm, and with his right arm he struck Payne with the axe to his brain. Payne didn't die immediately, but he eventually died the Saturday that followed. Austin, that fall, during the session of the Lawrence County Circuit Court, Austin was charged with premeditated murder. Everything showed that the murder was not premeditated, but that was the charge. However, the antebellum justice system in Arkansas also allowed Austin, who was considered a poor person, direct quote from the document, should have access to a lawyer. So in the cases of crime, slaves were prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, but they were also afforded access to procedural rules of justice, including access to free counsel for which they couldn't pay otherwise. His lawyers, of course, were very able. They were Hubert F. Fairchild and R.S. Anderson, especially active was Fairchild, and they immediately filed a motion to block some of the testimony that suggested that Austin was improper to his master, which would immediately prejudice a jury of white male, possibly slave owners, because Austin would be guilty before he was even tried. The state argued that the object of presenting this testimony was precisely to show that Austin was in rebellion against his master, and that was a serious, very, very serious matter. Of course, the circuit court judge of Independence County, his name was Beaufort H. Neely, sustained the state argument and overruled the motion of the defense. Matthew Pryor, an interesting guy, served as a witness for the state. Matthew was also a prison guard. He was the guy who also guarded Austin at the time of his imprisonment and kept Austin in chains. Presumably during that confinement, he asked Austin what had Payne done to him to cause Austin to kill him, as if Austin planned to kill Payne. So whatever Austin said was not recorded, but whatever his reply was interpreted and presented in court as an admission of guilt. As, yes, indeed, I planned to kill Payne, and that's it. So I did it. The defense objected. Judge Neely predictably overruled the motion. The court, the interesting fact about this case is that it went to the Arkansas Supreme Court because Austin had good lawyers that appealed the case after the verdict, and that was a guilty verdict, and that was a death sentence. However, the Arkansas Supreme Court disagreed with Judge Neely's ruling about allowing a presumed confession of guilt to stand. Yet, they said, well, as improper as it was, that confession is a confession and it will stand. So whatever Austin said in front of that witness, okay, he admitted to being guilty, so we'll allow it, even though Judge Neely made a mistake of allowing it. So they said, also that in prosecutions for offense, Negroes are to be treated as other people. And Judge Neely indeed also erred in refusing Watson, whom the defense requested to cross-examine, to have that Judge Neely should not have refused and barred Watson from testifying. It didn't matter at the end that Austin's confession was good for nothing. It didn't matter that there were mitigating factors and that he was clearly acting in self-defense. The court finally stipulated that if the jury should find the defendant was in rebellion to the authority of his master, then Payne had the right to take the defendant and use such force as was necessary. And if the defendant then attacked Payne and slew him, then he, Austin, was guilty of murder. When a slave is in rebellion to the awful authority of his master, whatever force that may be necessary to bring him within the pale of subordination invades no right of the slave, and consequently does him no such wrong as the law can recognize as a mitigating factor. That was the end of it. Austin was found guilty a second time, and he was, we don't know for sure, but he was most certainly put to death. Another case that records the experiences of slaves. However, this one is a lot more positive and shows how white people, including slave masters, often help their slaves in the best way possible. One such example was John S. Moore, a Lawrence County citizen who at one time served as Justice of the Peace. Apparently, Hubbard and Jane were slaves owned by John Moore, and Elbert, a little slave boy, was their son. So, with the help of John S. Moore, Hubbard and Jane went to the estate of this particular person, of John B. Hammond, who was the executor of the Henderson White estate. Henderson White owned Elbert. And after he died, John B. Hammond became the executor of his estate, correct? So Elbert, as part of that estate, was going to be sold at an auction. And with the knowledge and full support of John S. Moore, the owner of Hubbard and Jane, a husband and wife, they went to John Hammond's estate and took the boy Elbert with them. For that, Jane was arrested and tried for kidnapping. So in August of 1836, John Moore, who was a part of the United States, sued John Moore for aiding and abetting the kidnapping of slave boy who belonged to the estate of a different person. Still, Moore was aided by. I'm running out of time. Okay. So people paid to have. Oh my God, I'm sorry. In any case, John Moore refused to allow Jane and Hubbard and Elbert to be arrested. He protected them with at the risk of his own life. Another slave master, Peter Holderman, he left Arkansas altogether in the 1850s with his slaves whom he freed after Arkansas adopted the expulsion of Negro Expulsion Act in Arkansas, sometimes in 1859. I think he's another example of a brave man who defied the system and helped his slave. But then Jacob is the final story. Jacob, he was a slave who was sublet to another person. He was mistreated very badly. He didn't see any end of his suffering, so he put an end to his life by throwing himself in the river and drowning. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatma. Those court
Hi.
cases are fascinating. Hi. Okay, so we're going to move into our question and answer session. So if you've got questions, you can put them down here in this Q&A box. It's down on the right-hand side column here. We're going to bring back our first 3 presenters so that the audience can see them, and then we'll direct a few questions their way as they come through. Here we are, getting everybody there. Hi, okay. So I'm going to start out with a question that's come in for you, Heather. In your assessment, how well have religious denominations been presented in these county histories? Are we missing some? I'm guessing it's probably the focus of that question. Or are they representative, I guess?
Yeah, no, that's actually a really great question. So in much the same way that these men wrote, who were white, wrote about white men, there's also a really uneven emphasis on like more of the Protestant religious denominations. Now, there is acknowledgement in both histories to Blessed Sacrament Catholic Church here, and of course St. Bernard's Hospital, which was formed by a group of nuns here originally. But beyond just sort of a cursory look at that, almost all of the other histories of the Protestant denominations get much more emphasis. And so that sort of goes hand in hand with a lot of the Jewish exclusion. There's like a cursory mention of Temple Israel, here in Jonesboro, while other denominations get a much more in-depth examination. So.
Thank you. And Fatma, can you tell us a bit, what do you think that those cases tell us about the fact that enslaved people were legally chattel, but whenever a mule tramples someone and kills them, it's usually not executed? So how are the courts playing with this idea of, or messing with this idea of the real status of enslaved folk?
Thank you for the question, Rebecca. I was a nervous wreck, but the last case we have answered that question. The case of Jacob, who was drowned while in the service of a person who hired him from his owner, the court decided that he was entirely a property, and if a property is damaged in the course of its being used, then there is no damage to be had. The defendant in that case, the person that was using Jacob, won the case because in other words, he was a property. Jacob was like a piece of machinery that was rented, and he damaged that property inadvertently. In other words, it wasn't Lot who caused the death of Jacob. It was seen that way. Jacob chose to kill himself because a rope was thrown to him in the river and he refused to take it. So Lot won the case on that basis. So when they prosecuted Austin, he was considered a full legal person and given the death penalty with no mitigating factors. And in the case of Jacob, however, he was a property and no one was at fault for his death. So it's interesting that it is. I don't think the courts ever reconciled that contradiction.
Heather, we've got another one for you from Story. And I don't know if the audience could see these, so I'm going to go ahead and read it out. We'll clarify that for the next session. But she thanks you for your presentation. And she said, in your studies of Craighead County, have you encountered types of primary sources on 19th and early 20th century local history that you would recommend to other community historians working in Arkansas? What type of source do you think maybe most often overlooked?
Okay, yeah, that's again a great question. Thank you so much for that, Story. So one of the really great records that we have here in Jonesboro specifically are some of the records from the Black churches. And those are sources that were not looked at all by either Williams or Stuck when they were writing their histories. And it's probably one of the reasons that they're just completely, those stories of the Black churches are completely excluded from those county narratives as well. And so in addition to that, I also think that just how we read even traditional sources like our newspapers goes a long way. So Williams and Stuck both were looking at the plethora of newspapers that existed in Craighead County in the late 1800s and early 20th century, but they were not really examining it with that critical of an eye. They were sort of taking those newspaper articles at face value, even though those newspaper articles were written mostly by people with tremendous amounts of bias, white men who thought certain ways about race, thought certain ways about gender. And so one of the things that I've tried to do in my research, specifically with my dissertation that does look at African American history in Jonesboro, is sometimes I'm looking at the same sources that they looked at, but I'm looking at them with a very critical eye, acknowledging the bias that exists in those newspapers as well. And so sometimes it's not just about what sources we need to add to look at, but about how we're looking at even those traditional sources that already exist, as I'm sure Story already knows too. But that's a great question for sure.
Thank you. And Gary, I'm going to go back to one that you kind of already answered, but it was about how to access the collection, and it's Dr. Margulis is in charge of it. But can people access clips, and will they have to worry about any copyright issues if they wanted to use clips from that collection, perhaps in presentations like you did today?
Access is limited. There's no direct online access at the moment. Dr. Natasha Margulis is one who is in charge of it. In fact, she's the only individual who's actually seen all 6,000 clips. And last year, the head of the archives, Dr. Brady Banta, retired, and he has not been replaced yet. So Dr. Margulis has her hands full, but will be glad to answer questions on the timeline of when they might be accessible and might be able to provide information about what is actually in the archives. So I have to defer to her.
Okay, well, thank you. And they can contact you for her contact information if they don't know how. Sure.
Right.
Susan has a question, and I believe this is for Fatme. Are all early court records kept at the county courthouses, or are they kept at the Arkansas State Archives? Is there a cutoff date? What's the range that's available?
Historically, a lot of people are aware that courthouse is burned. So it's not a given that a lot of court records survived. Lawrence County is kind of unique because we have, they survived through the years. And the courthouse in Powhatan where they were housed did burn, in the 1870s. However, the vault that they had the documents stored did survive, and that's the only reason why we have those records. As far as court records elsewhere, if they exist, and as far as they exist on county level, they're probably in the local courthouses, the way they are in Randolph County. But Lawrence County used to be a lot bigger than it currently is, so we have a lot of those early records that reference an area a lot bigger than present-day Lawrence County. Historical Lawrence County united southern Missouri, northern Arkansas. So what happened in current-day Lawrence County impacted the whole area. And we do have a lot of court records. I don't think our central office has had any collection or donations of court records per se from other counties. And to what extent, I don't know. In other words, we're kind of in a unique position.
Okay.
With the Lawrence County court records.
And I've gotten the impression from Dr. Kelly Jones's book that just came out recently that there are state-level Supreme Court cases, especially related to enslaved folks. So this, if it made it up to the state Supreme Court, those might also be a resource for people. If it got out, even if that courthouse burned, that might be another place to look if you're going after this type of history.
The Supreme Court case files, I don't know where those are.
We'll get Dr. Jones to jump in maybe in a comment since I brought it up for her, put her on the spot. Okay, I have a question from Patty for Heather. It's my understanding that there's some history written about the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. I'm assuming that's what STFU is abbreviating, which was a cross-racial organization. My question is, what other resources did you explore that might have included the history of African Americans in Craighead County, such as cemeteries?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So yeah, there has been quite a bit written about the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. That most of that history centers on the counties just south of Craighead County, in places like Poinsett County specifically. One of the things that I have done in some of my research is I have definitely gone out into the segregated cemeteries here in Jonesboro. There's a Knights of Pythias cemetery in Jonesboro where I can find names, birth date, death dates. That's good starts to researching individual people. But one of the real benefits here has been that even though the African American history of Craighead County has not been preserved by white historians, the Black community here in Jonesboro has gone to great lengths to preserve its own history. And so we actually even have in one of our community centers, we have a museum, an African American cultural center / museum that houses a lot of information. It houses newspaper articles about Jonesboro's Black community. It houses artifacts from the segregated school that existed here. And so that's one of the things I really want to make clear too, is that just because this history isn't one that Williams or Stuck or maybe a lot of white Arkansas historians have really focused on, Jonesboro's Black community has done just a phenomenal job at preserving its own history. And so I've been fortunate enough to really meet some of those folks who are preserving that history, and they have just given me so much assistance and help in trying to really add Jonesboro's Black history to Arkansas's broader history as well.
All right, Gary, I think you may have answered this a bit, but just to clarify, we've got another question from Patty. Are any of these films available in a digital format online? I think you may have mentioned no, but I will direct people to the event chat that Dr. Margulis did put her information there. But Gary, go ahead.
Well, I had the opportunity to scrutinize 30 of the 206 reels when doing research for my documentary. So there are clips from those 30 reels that are online. If you go to Vimeo and do a search for A State Archives, you will find them. And Dr. Margulis has posted a few clips that are also available online, but we still have 5,000 to go plus.
Wow.
So there are examples that shows the quality and some of the efforts that the archives have done and that my research has done, but there's more to come.
Thank you. All right, we've got about 45 more seconds, so if that may, I'm going to send you this last question. Are you aware of any efforts by the state to acquire and preserve county records that are currently kept in poor conditions inside courthouse basements and attics?
we have tried ourselves to acquire certain collections, and on local level, people resist because to them that's heritage, and they want to keep them in place, keep them in their own county seat so that they can attract tourists and tell their stories with their original documents. But we keep working on that. We try to explain to them that the conditions are very important, and that if those documents are not preserved, they're going to eventually deteriorate to oblivion. So we make efforts to convince people, and we reach out constantly. And I think we're making some progress. But so far, they tend to prefer to keep it.
Yes. All right, so that's it for this session. We have a 5-minute break, and we will see you back here. So looking forward to another great session of presenters. Thank you all very much. Big hands to our presenters. Thank you, audience. You've been excellent on sending us questions and participating, and we'll see you back soon.
Arkansas newspapers, we got them. Boy, do we. The Arkansas State Archives preserves on paper and on film the largest extant collection of Arkansas serial imprints. For over 6 decades, Archives staff microfilmers have been at work saving runs of Arkansas newspapers and creating durable editions of these vital chronicles of what's happened when. Patrons may consult microfilms in-house and also increasingly at home. As partners with the National Digital Newspaper Program, we're making thousands of pages of Arkansas journalism available through the Library of Congress's Chronicling America site. We've done a lot of work, but the work goes on. As long as there are more papers to collect and to film. Because here at the Arkansas State Archives, our mission is to save the stories, 200 years worth of them and more, and to keep them safe for you to explore. Since 1905, the Arkansas State Archives has been busy finding, collecting, preserving, making available, and interpreting the evidence of our state's fascinating and significant past. In our collections, one can find a few government documents, some racy pictures, fine art, a huge collection of Arkansas journalism, and lots of neat old stuff. We welcome patrons, family history seekers, authors, students, academics, and the just plain curious to our 3 locations in Little Rock, at Powhatan Courthouse State Park, and at historic Washington State Park. Or online, where you can explore our ever-growing Arkansas Digital Archives collections. However you choose to visit us, we look forward to serving you. At the Arkansas State Archives, we preserve Arkansas's stories, 200 years worth and more, and they're all here for you to explore.
Hi, my name is Marilyn Knapp. I'm with the Arkansas Archaeological Society. The society is composed of volunteers in the state and across the nation who want to learn more about archaeology and Arkansas's past. Congratulations to the Arkansas Historical Association on their 80th annual conference. Way to go.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the 80th Arkansas Historical Association Annual Conference. My name is Mel Zabecki, and I'm the Arkansas State Archaeologist, the new one, so a lot of you might not have met me before. But I work at the Arkansas Archaeological Survey, and if you don't know too much about the survey, it's actually made up of 10 research stations all around the state that are charged with doing public archaeology, answering people's questions, doing their own research, and they do a ton of stuff. So I reside at the up over in Fayetteville at the coordinating office, but there are archaeologists that cover the entire state and have territories all around. So if you ever have questions, contact us. We're at archaeology.uark.edu, or just Google Arkansas Archaeology and you'll find us. And you can also contact me personally at 575-6550 or email me at mzabeck@uark.edu. So get in touch with us. We'd love to learn about what you have questions about. Take care. Bye.
Hi, I'm Shema Best, Executive Director with the Arkansas Humanities Council, and I would like to welcome you to the 80th Arkansas Historical Association Annual Conference 2021. The Arkansas Humanities Council has and remains a proud supporter of the Arkansas Historical Association. With sessions around this year's conference theme of collective memory in the natural state, commemoration, preservation, and reconciliation, there is no doubt this is going to be a very exciting and informative conference that you will truly enjoy. Please keep the Arkansas Humanities Council in mind when seeking grant funding for humanities-based projects. We have a number of grant opportunities offered throughout the year, including the new African American History and Culture Grant and Access to the Humanities Grant. Enjoy the conference, and I wish you all the very best.
Hello, members and presenters at the Arkansas Historical Association meeting. We hope that you're enjoying the program. Saying hello here from the Arkansas Tech University History and Political Science Department. And I don't think it's too bold to say that we hope to see you guys out here in Russellville for a future meeting of the Arkansas Historical Association. Enjoy. You guys want to wave?
How are we supposed to end these things, right? So I thought the break was going to be just dead air, but that was something I'm not sure I wanted to miss. So good information in there. All right, so we are heading back into our second session. So housekeeping items in case you just joined us. Along the right-hand column of your screen here, you've got the event chat box. That's a little talkie box. And I recommend scrolling back up and reading. We've got some really good comments in there. These are to talk to other conference participants and to compliment our excellent presenters. And then at the bottom, we have the Q&A box where you can send in questions for the question and answer period. We'll have 3 presenters that will speak for about 15 minutes each, and then we'll have a 15-minute question and answer session before a break, and then the final 3 presenters of the afternoon. So our first presenter for this session is Dr. W. Dale Weeks. He's a scholar of Native American history during the Civil War era and also considers racial identity and acceptance in 19th century America. He's currently editing 2 sets of unpublished Civil War letters, both written by Texans who served in Indian Territory and in Arkansas during the war. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Weeks.
Howdy. Welcome to the Bryan College Station, Texas area. We're dodging thunderstorms currently, so it may be kind of interesting here. A little bit about my presentation. Part of my dissertation research took me in and out of Arkansas frequently. But I want to talk a little bit about the Fort Smith Commission. The Fort Smith Commission Council took place in September of 1865, and it was aimed at negotiating new treaties with the Indian tribes of Indian Territory that had aligned themselves with the Confederacy. But I want us to think about, how we remember this event and kind of more on a national scale, and this council's impact on U.S. Indian policy, not just that one small region. So bear with me, let's take a look. Myth and the massacre at Little Bighorn. Now I know that covers an enormous amount of time and just content. So let me kind of sum it up. This is one chapter basically out of what began as my dissertation, what is now a manuscript that's currently being reviewed for publication, titled Civil Warrior, Cherokee Chief John Ross's Defense of U.S. Constitutional Law and Tribal Sovereignty During the American Civil War. Again, this is a chapter towards the end of the work. There's a lot of groundwork that leads up to this, and there's even a lot of information after this chapter. So at some point, I would encourage you, once this publication process is complete, just buy the book if you find any interest in this presentation. Let's talk a little bit about the historical focus of the Fort Smith Council. Held between September 8 and 21st, 1865, in those months immediately following the Civil War. It was an effort on the part of the United States government to reestablish relationships with the tribes of Indian Territory who had signed treaties of alliance with the Confederacy in 1861. So this was an important event in U.S. Indian policy. It was kind of the culmination of the Civil War in the West in lots of sense. But I want to look at the historical focus. How have historians viewed the events at Fort Smith? Well, for the most part, the primary actors during the Fort Smith Council have always, I say always, for the most part, are usually considered to be Dennis Cooley, who was the new Commissioner of Indian Affairs, and John Ross, the chief of the Cherokees, who ironically didn't even attend most of the council. But these two men kind of led the opposition against each other. And most of what you read about the Fort Smith Council will kind of focus on these two men particularly. But I would argue that there was another individual present who turned out to be more important to U.S. Indian policy. His name was Ely Parker. Now, for years I referred to him as Eli, but he described in his own writing that his name, Ely, rhymes with the word freely. So he is Ely Parker. Ely Parker was a Seneca Indian from upstate New York. He actually was the Sachem of the Iroquois Confederacy. Sachem is not like what we would consider a chief. Somehow in American culture, we get the idea that the chief is the same embodiment of political power as our president is. But, the Sachem wasn't an elected leader who made all the decisions. The Sachem was kind of a trusted advisor, kind of a wise one. So he had a different belief of the way tribal governments ran. We'll get to that here shortly. As an engineer, working as an engineer prior to Civil War, Parker did receive a very good education. Working as an engineer in Illinois, where he met Ulysses S. Grant and became a very trusted advisor, became his aide during the war. In fact, if you look at some of the more famous pictures, here's Grant in the middle of his staff. Here on the right is Ely Parker. Old painting of the surrender at Appomattox. There's General Lee, General Grant sitting proudly watching the surrender. Right off of Grant's shoulder is again Ely Parker. Probably this painting is probably more of an artifact of its time than accurate. Shows Grant and Lee. It does have Parker probably depicted more aboriginally and relegated to the back wall, but nonetheless, Parker is present in the room even in this picture. A little more accurate painting shows Lee and Grant seated at the desk, and right off of Grant's elbow is once again his aide, Ely Parker. And probably this more accurate, more detailed painting, you see Parker again right off of Grant's shoulder. So Parker was present. Parker was an important part of Grant's administration. In fact, he became very influential with the Grant administration, and not just as president, but even in those years between the end of the Civil War and Grant's election, when Grant was still in charge militarily and therefore in charge of a lot of the implementation of Indian policy. He relied on Parker's advice toward Indian policy militarily, and then even when he became president. And when Grant did become president, he named Ely Parker as Commissioner of Indian Affairs in 1869. So Parker was very influential. Parker was a significant actor in U.S. Indian policy in the years after the Civil War. But more importantly to what we're talking about today is he was president at Fort Smith. And he was a part of the presidential council. So what took place at Fort Smith? Well, new President Andrew Johnson's administration wanted to dictate the surrender terms to the tribes who had signed treaties with the Confederates. Although John Ross resisted on the claim that the Cherokees were not guilty. They had not been disloyal at all. Ross didn't even attend the meetings. He continued to deny any disloyalty and blamed their Confederate alliance on the U.S. treaty abrogation in 1861, when the United States abandoned the forts in Indian Territory, therefore abrogating their treaty responsibility to protect the tribes from invasion. And the Confederates invaded. John Ross claimed that's exactly what you were supposed to protect us from. And so Ross blamed the entire Cherokee Confederate alliance on the fact that the U.S. left them, that had abandoned them, and therefore they were pressured by the Confederates. And his stance even encouraged for a while the Creek delegation to reconsider, to resist as well. And as a result, the commissioners really, they voted actually to depose Ross as principal chief. Now, they didn't have the authority necessarily to remove him as chief, but they certainly agreed not to treat him as chief, to not recognize him as the chief of the Cherokee. So why did Ross resist so much? What was his motivation for resisting at Fort Smith? Why did he deny disloyalty? What gave him any belief that he was innocent? Well, this is where we can introduce this man, Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln did openly acknowledge the abrogation of the United States in 1861. And he even tried to return the troops to Indian Territory in an attempt to reestablish the relationship with the tribes and reestablish the pre-war treaties. He did this during the war, the Indian Expedition of 1862 and the Federal Indian Brigade of 1863. Both of these efforts to occupy Fort Gibson, to reestablish the Cherokee tribe in Indian Territory. These were not military, these were not actions of military strategy. These were attempts to reinstate the treaties with the tribes. And my manuscript goes in great detail describing the politics behind this, the decision behind this, and how this operated. So Lincoln, Ross's claim of loyalty was based on the fact that Lincoln had acknowledged the abrogation, had tried to reestablish the treaty. Ross believed the Cherokee Nation had proven its loyalty to Lincoln, and that Lincoln was ready to restore the tribe completely to its pre-war treaty status. And that he had communicated that to Ross. And it wasn't just Ross. There were military commanders who also were under the impression. John Pope was under the impression that Lincoln was reestablishing the treaties. The existing Commissioner of Indian Affairs, William Dole, he was under the impression again that that's exactly what Lincoln intended to do. It's exactly what he communicated to Ross. And so Ross came away believing that Abraham Lincoln was set to reestablish had reestablished already the pre-war treaties, and that the Cherokee were not guilty. And so when the Cherokee went into this post-war council, Ross didn't even attend because he assumed it was a foregone conclusion that Lincoln had reestablished the treaty from the United States perspective. When the United States abandoned Indian Territory, the United States was the only one that could reestablish the treaty, and Ross believed Lincoln did just that. Well, here lies the problem. An April evening at Ford's Theater, President Lincoln was assassinated, which ushered in instantly a new administration of Andrew Johnson. And Johnson just flat out did not agree with Lincoln. He believed that he declared all pre-war treaties to be invalid. Any tribe that signed with the Confederacy was disloyal, and he declared that all tribes in Indian Territory had forfeited all of their rights under the pre-war treaties. That included their right to protection, that included their rights to the land that they owned. And that was his key. He wanted some of that land as a place to move many of the Plains tribes into Indian Territory. And so he adamantly sent the commissioners to Fort Smith in 1865 to negotiate just these treaties. All tribes were guilty. All tribes had forfeited their rights under the pre-war treaties, and that he wanted land in Indian Territory for these new tribes. And Dennis Cooley and Ely Parker and the rest of the commissioners were ordered to acquire just those treaties, even with the Cherokee. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Ely Parker, as a part of these negotiations, watched the Cherokees resist a new treaty. And it wasn't just a innocent bystander. Historians treat Parker's position on the Fort Smith Council as a novelty. Simply, he's an Indian, and therefore the other Indians liked having an Indian on this council. It was much more than that. Parker, who became very influential in Indian policy, watched with anger at John Ross and how Ross resisted this new treaty. Remember, Parker, as an Indian, had certain beliefs as to what an Indian was like. So Parker developed much of his personal beliefs toward Indian policy as a result of watching Ross and the Cherokees resist at Fort Smith. Parker came to believe that Indian tribes do not have a wealthy class of elite leaders. It's not an Indian nation. So if there's a wealthy class of leadership, like in the Cherokees who had a constitution, elected officials, that's not what Indian tribes do. This elected elite leadership controlling this Indian nation is not natural. Indian tribes, he believed, are not Republican-style governmental organizations, and there is definitely a difference between a Democratic and a Republican-style government. Parker believed that the Indian tribes were more democratic. All the men got together, and the men discussed, and the men kind of agreed, where the Cherokees were now following a more white-style Republican government, and he had issues with that. He also believed that if you treat a tribe as an independent nation, that is exactly how they will act. They'll act as an independent nation, and they will not do what federal government demands that they do, which is exactly what Ross was doing at Fort Smith. And Parker came to believe that the culprit of this is the treaties. The United States must stop the practice of treaty making with Indian nations. The idea of signing a treaty, giving the tribes certain levels of sovereignty, certain autonomy, given a certain level of autonomy, giving them control of their own borders, giving them control of their own politics, giving them the right to be an independent nation, even though they're not an independent nation, he said, is exactly why Ross is acting like this, because their treaties tell them they don't have to follow the government. And so he said the treaties are the problem. And so Ely Parker left Fort Smith with this mission to end the treaty-making process. And although not everyone agreed with him, he used his great influence with those in Washington. And Congress did vote to put an end to treaty-making in 1871. Now, what does this mean? And for the sake of time here, some very important truth here. The resulting change in the relationship between the United States and its indigenous neighbors helped to bring about the violence that dominated U.S.-Indian relations after 1871. While the United States still signed treaties, these were never Senate-ratified treaties anymore. They were more, this is a document that these commissioners will sign. This is showing you what the United States intends to do. After 1871, these treaties were never Senate ratified. They were never treated as a formal treaty. It was more a written promise to the tribe of the United States. Did not guarantee any Indian tribe the right of any autonomy. They could use the land, but didn't give them the land. They certainly didn't have full control over the land. The United States still retained control of it. Now, obviously, the Indian nations that resisted this in great detail, and that in itself, and for the sake of time, you can go to my manuscript and kind of follow to see how this really led to the massacre of the Little Bighorn in 1876 and even Wounded Knee in 1890, when the United States simply did not have to go to court anymore. They simply did not have to honor the treaties as Senate ratified treaties. If the United States wanted the Black Hills, the United States could take the Black Hills. If the United States wanted you to stop the ghost dance, then you had to stop the ghost dance. The United States held full autonomy and full sovereignty on Indian land, and Indians were not given And as a result, that resulted directly from Ely Parker's time at Fort Smith, from watching the interaction between John Ross and the commissioner, particularly Dennis Cooley. It covered a lot of ground in a very short amount of time. I know you have a lot of questions, perhaps. Again, look for my book to come out. University of Oklahoma Press right now is reviewing it. The early returns look good, and so hopefully here within the next few months to a year, we'll have the book out and get more information here. But thank you for listening.
Or Dale, excuse me, Dawn is up next. That is the time period that we really need scholarship on. So I'm so glad that you're focusing on that. And it's totally okay that you're from Texas. We welcome a lot of Texans, and I think that most people have forgiven me for having 2 degrees from Maine. So we're glad to have you among us. All right, our next speaker is Dawn C. Bragg. Dr. Bragg is project leader and research forester with the USDA Research Forest Services Southern Research Station. He's stationed at Monticello. He holds bachelor's degrees and master's, a bachelor's and master's degrees in forestry and a PhD in forest ecology. He publishes numerous pieces on the history of forestry and the General Land Office surveys. His current efforts include developing the centennial history of the Southern Research Station. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bragg.
Well, thank you, Becky, for the introduction. And what I'm going to talk to you today about in video form is a really kind of neat corner of the state of Arkansas that almost disappeared from our collective memory and not that long ago. So with that, let's take a look.
Now for some context. By the late 1920s, the big cut of timber in the eastern United States was winding down, with very little of the virgin timber remaining. But the timber industry had not completely disappeared, and pressure to ensure continued timber supply remained. The emergence of forestry as a discipline in the early decades of the 20th century, plus the concurrent formation of national forests in places such as Arkansas, suggested of the future potential. National forests were particularly looked to for the provision of timber to those mills that remained, especially given that these were often the areas that still had old-growth forests to cut. Well into the 1930s, the timber industry and most of the public thought only old-growth or virgin timber was of sufficient quality for their needs. Of course, most of that timber had been cut, meaning that only limited amounts of this prime resource remained. The Ouachita and Ozark National Forest sought assistance from the Southern Forest Experiment Station to develop silvicultural practices and extend the availability of mature shortleaf pine timber production. And this included a strong push for an experimental forest dedicated to that work. Initially, this effort to establish an experimental forest did not go well, as can be seen in the following quote by W.G. Wallenberg from his report in his early 1931 search for such a forest. Our failure to find a suitable area may be attributed in part to setting up too high ideals and hopes. It was also very largely due to an inadequate picture of local conditions to start with, and a vague conception of the real problems and their relative importance. In lowering our sights, we must also decide where to aim. It would seem best to reserve as a natural area some tract having a particularly well-stocked stand of virgin pine. The more nearly average virgin stands on the Ouachita Forest are too badly understocked, too irregular, too defective, and too sad a remnant of abuse to be worthy of preservation. This is hardly glowing praise. In truth, the experimental forest search party led by Wallenberg did find some good stands of virgin pine timber remaining in the Ouachitas, such as the one pictured here, but not enough of suitable extent to make a good experimental forest to study the silvicultural questions then being asked. Note in this picture the large shortleaf pines and open, frequently burned, grassy understory. Although the Southern Forest Experiment Station initially resisted, the Ouachita National Forest and the Forest Service's Washington office persisted, and in a few years after the 1931 trip of Wallenberg, the agency set aside 8,978 acres in eastern Polk and Scott counties as the Irons Fork Experimental Forest. The research was now to focus on forest influences, which is basically the relationships between forests, soils, and water, rather than silviculture, although timber management certainly affects how forests, soils, and water interact. By 1936, a lead investigator, Bud Collette, was dispatched to the location, and a series of studies were proposed for development. This circa 1939 map shows the final boundary of the Irons Fork Experimental Forest in relation to the local communities, roads, rivers, and mountains of western Arkansas. Also note the location of the administrative site of the experimental forest along the Odense Iron Fork Truck Trail. This is about 20 miles east of Mena. Infrastructure to support the research program starts getting built in 1937, including roads, the administrative site, and the installation of a number of studies. Most of the infrastructure was built by crews from the CCC and WPA, with assistance from the Ouachita National Forest, and limited staffing and funds from the Southern Forest Experiment Station. Land acquisition was not an issue, at least not initially, as the property was all part of the existing land base of the Ouachita National Forest. This differed from the Crossett Experimental Forest, which was on privately owned land in southern Arkansas. A later effort to expand the Irons Fork administrative site by acquiring an adjoining 10-acre parcel from a local landowner took over a year to complete because of their reluctance to sell, at least at the rate offered by the government. This sale was eventually completed, but this is a story for a later date. Here is a closer-in map of the Irons Fork Experimental Forest, with some key features identified by red text. The main CCC camp to support the experimental forest, Camp F-13 near the Bucknob Fire Tower, was actually located off of the forest. The map in the middle of this slide is a layout of the Irons Fork administrative site in July of 1940, showing the layout of the buildings, roads, and other infrastructure at that time. Notice the very classic CCC-styled building architecture of wooden local stone apparent in the dormitory lodging buildings, as well as the headquarters sign along the Oden Irons Fork Truck Trail. While I've yet to find a photograph of the office and laboratory building, the plan taken from a 1938 publication by the Forest Service provides a good representation of this particular structure. Unfortunately, today virtually nothing is left of any of the structures at this site. The crowning glory of the research infrastructure at the Irons Fork Experimental Forest was this Columbus Deep Notch Weir built on West Nesbitt Creek in 1942. This concrete and probably stone water control structure was designed to funnel stream water through the calibrated notches to estimate the volume of water flowing down this valley. This weir was built with concrete acquired through the Ouachita National Forest using CCC labor and was intended to be the design and scale of the other weirs planned for this study area. However, only this one weir was constructed at this scale. The others built were much smaller. Here is a picture of the Columbus Deep Notch Weir on West Nesbitt Creek as it looked in December of 2020, with my 6-foot-plus tall son Kenny providing scale. The large notch in the weir was designed to gauge the stream flow at high flow events, while the smaller notch in the concrete was for more conventional stream flow in this small creek. As I mentioned earlier, most of the weirs built were of the smaller style. Note the stream flow recording equipment on the right of this picture. The rock riprap in the background was added by the CCC to armor the channel and help direct the stream flow towards the weir. My youngest son, Stephen, provides scale for the present-day remains of these weirs and riprap, now recorded archaeological sites. Weather data were also recorded at several locations on the Irons Fork Experimental Forest. This picture is of a recording rain gauge located on a ridge line in the Hoover Creek drainage. Note the open forest on the ridge in the background of this picture and the very stony ground in the foreground. A variety of devices were designed and built to test various conditions in a more controlled setting, such as the one that allowed for different soil and vegetation conditions to be tested using a controlled quantity of water. Controlled laboratory conditions do not always translate well to real-world circumstances, so other designs were developed in the field to compare similar conditions. These sets of paired devices would divert precipitation that fell on the slopes in the background, covered with different types of vegetation, to examine their influence on surface runoff. Dozens of these paired plots were established and calibrated for later large-scale force manipulation studies, most of which never happened. Studies to evaluate different water flow diverters or spreaders were installed to determine if such installations, done at large scale across watersheds, could help reduce peak storm flow in the rocky thin soils of the Ouachita Mountains. The picture on the left shows one such design, built to obstruct the flow of water down the slope and to store it in the basin behind the Rip Rap Dam. The chart on the right shows a schematic how this water storage trench was intended to work and how many such trenches were needed to contain various amounts of rainfall in this small drainage example. More practical, and therefore more implemented, would have been some of the erosion control studies done by the staff of the Irons Fork Experimental Forest, usually at locations off of the forest. In this picture, a bank fixation study using different kinds of ground cover was tested along one of the nearby roads to determine which worked best to protect road cuts from erosion. Even after Bud Collette had left and was replaced by new lead Norman Hawes, heading into the early 1940s, there were big plans on the Irons Fork. According to Southern Forest Experiment Station annual reports from this time, these plans included furthering the work and technical guidance on road bank stabilization, as well as refining the practical methods on corrective actions for erosion in the Ouachitas, where investigations are new and only exploratory studies have been made. And, most importantly, to complete a comprehensive analysis of forest influences problems in the Ouachita Mountains, to serve as a guide for future investigations. While the Irons Fork Experimental Forest grew quickly between 1937 and 1942, trouble was brewing. The Southern Forest Experiment Station was chronically underfunded during the 1920s and 30s, limiting growth and causing continuous scrambles for resources. In 1939, newly elected Congressman William Fadjo Cravens, whose 4th district included the Irons Fork Experimental Forest, was given a tour of the forest. Within a month, he was called upon to help secure funding for work on the Irons Fork by testifying at a USDA Appropriations Subcommittee hearing for the fiscal 1941 budget. The fiscal year 1940 appropriation for work on the Irons Fork was $3,500. In fiscal year 1941, the Forest Service sought $28,500. Cravens became a big fan of the work of the Irons Fork, as his testimony indicated. The Forest Service is finding out what can be done to keep the water where it fell as long as possible. The possibilities of the research station are endless. Out of such fact-finding studies come the basis for policies which are of infinite importance in preserving the values in our forests and safeguarding the values located in the valleys far below. Extra funds were needed in part because the large civilian relief workforce that helped build the Irons Fork Experimental Forest infrastructure started to diminish during the late 1930s and became much smaller in the early 1940s as the national economy improved and the nation started building up for an anticipated war. As with the rest of the nation, December 7, 1941 forever changed the future of the Irons Fork Experimental Forest. The Southern Forest Experiment Station immediately pivoted its work to supporting the war effort, as these quotes from the annual reports between 1942 and 1944 indicate. Not only did the station curtail normal research activities, they worked on projects to boost the production of war material, as well as lost staff to service in the military and transfers to supporting civilian war agencies. By 1943, the station made the decision to not only suspend the forest influences line of research that the Irons Fork Experimental Forest conducted, but to end it entirely. At this time, there were no Forest Service staff at Irons Fork, and the agency continued to focus on supporting the war until its 1945 end. In the 1946 Forest Service directory, the Irons Fork Experimental Forest was one of 4 listed by the Southern Forest Experiment Station as inactive. Forest influences work would not be resumed until the mid-1950s, but not at the still inactive Irons Fork. Rather, the new Alum Creek Experimental Forest northeast of Hot Springs would be the home for this work starting in 1958. In 1959, the Irons Fork Experimental Forest was reduced in size to 1,280 acres. The remote location of the Irons Fork and decaying condition of those facilities deterred the Southern Forest Experiment Station from restarting work there. In 1969, the final remnant of the Irons Fork was disestablished as an experimental forest and returned to general forest management by the Ouachita National Forest. Decades later, all that remained of the Irons Fork was some brief mentions in old reports, some crumbling remains of the ground, and a few boxes of historical records rescued from oblivion by Ouachita National Forest archaeologist Maria Schleit. Over the last decade, the Forest Service has made some limited efforts to better document the rapid rise and slow decline of what had once been the largest experimental forest in the southeastern United States. Is a new life possible for this old experimental forest? In addition to updating and recording 6 archaeological sites on the former Irons Fork Experimental Forest, Forest Service and university scientists are now looking at old-growth pine and oak trees on parts of the area. Some of these trees are likely 200 to 300 years old and can tell us a lot about past climates and fire patterns using dendrochronology. This is truly living history.
Certainly, if you have any other questions, there's my contact information, and you are welcome to contact me, and I'll be around for questions later as well.
Thank you so much, John. In Arkansas history, it seems like we're never far from the land. So it's fascinating that you've got that line of inquiry going and are bringing us some really interesting information. Thank you. So up next is Jamie Sloan. She's our last presenter for this session. We do have another session that will start with 3 more presenters. So we're more than halfway through. I would remind you that you can submit questions in the little Q&A box for our Q&A session, which will be with these 3 presenters after Ms. Sloan finishes speaking. And Jamie Sloan is a master's student at Missouri State University. Her research interests are focused on Arkansas history, Civil War and Reconstruction, and racial issues in the U.S. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Sloan.
Thanks, Rebecca. My project is Lost Arkansas, Historic Site Mapping and GIS. In simple terms, it is a website with a GIS map of historic sites in Arkansas. In more technical terms, it is a website that uses a PostGIS database to store historic sites and display them on a leaflet front end. The Lost Arkansas project is an easy way for the public to find historical sites throughout the state. When traveling throughout Arkansas, the interactive map enables people to plan out routes to visit based on the historic markers, museums, or historic state parks they would like to see. The map also supports the smaller sites that do not have a website or that are not easily accessible. The public expects to consume things digitally nowadays, especially the younger generation. So there is a need for an easy-to-use map available to the public so that these museums can continue to be operational. Today, there is more focus on monuments and historic markers, so Lost Arkansas can help people understand and remember the history they represent. The website is currently a map of over 60 historic sites in Arkansas. With it being an ongoing project, it brings together all of these sites in one easy-to-view location. The map makes it easy to see the site, the website, location, and current and historical images. So the field that the website falls under is digital humanities. Digital humanities is a growing field of study that focuses on applying modern technological tools and methods to the field of humanities. For example, in the field of history, this is mostly seen in the process of digitizing and indexing historical sources and data. This can include anything from scanning documents and from scanning documents and sources to indexing them or using modern GIS tools to map and display geographical information. So why this project is important. Digital humanities, in my opinion, is critical to the future of the field of history because increasingly the public and the younger generation expect to be able to search and access large amounts of information online easily. They expect everything to just be at their fingertips. Especially when it comes to public engagement, it is essential to provide an easy-to-use index or comprehensive map of available sites and information. The site that I like to use is the Skirmish of Chalk Bluff. This is a small site in northeast Arkansas in the middle of nowhere on a dead-end road. And the site is hard to find even if you know where it is, and it's even harder when somebody doesn't know that it exists. And I like to use this site because it is a small site, but it plays into the larger context of the history of Arkansas and the Civil War. So why I decided to create this website? Well, there was a global pandemic going on to start with, and this was something that I'd been wanting to do for a while, but I never had the time, and with everything locked down, I was finally able to do it. And so last summer, my husband, who is a software engineer, did the back end part of it, and I began working on mapping the sites and creating the database. Along with the global pandemic was everybody was trying to get away from big cities. They were trying to get away from people and social distance. So I thought this website would be a good way for people that don't normally go out to the middle of nowhere to find these historic sites like Civil War sites and state park sites and keep that history alive. And one of the big reasons I did it with Arkansas, I live in Missouri currently. One of the reasons why I did it with Arkansas was because I grew up in Arkansas, and Arkansas history is extremely important to me. And so I was able to continue working on the website as part of an independent internship at Lindenwood University with my professors, Dr. Chris Smith and Tara Van Sel. And like I said, this is still an ongoing project. So the site selection. Of course, the sites on the website are historic sites, they're historic markers, they're national park sites, they're state park sites that in some shape, form, or fashion talk about Arkansas history. And these go from like just the county historical sites all the way up to like the national park sites, the more recognized sites, I guess. And so sites like the Southern Tenant Farmers Museum, Lakeport Plantation, the Central High National Park site, they each tell a different part of Arkansas history, and they show different eras in Arkansas history. And so by being able to have this website where I can bring together the different systems, it makes it easier to be able to look for, sites that are just Civil War or sites that are just state parks kind of thing. So this is a screenshot of what the website looks like. If you just pull up the website is historytour.us, and it can be accessed by a computer or by a phone. And eventually a mobile app will be created once I learn how to do so. This is just pretty much what the homepage looks like. These are all the different points of interest, and each blue dot represents a different site in Arkansas. And like I think I said in a previous slide, there's over 60 sites on here currently, and there will be more added as time goes on. At the top on the toolbar, there is categories. So separating out by Civil War, state parks, national park sites. and there's multimedia to add primary source documents, to add videos, to add images, or anything like that will eventually be in there. So it can be more about the site than just going and visiting it. It can be more about learning about the site. Yeah. So this is a screenshot of one of my sites that I currently have. This is Lake Fork Plantation, and this is what a finished site looks like. It has a description of the site, it has the website, it has the address, and it has a current and historical image on it. Not all sites will look like this. Not all of them will have historical images. Like Civil War sites will not have images because, well, they won't. And some of the sites do not have websites, so it'll be a link to a Facebook page. Some of the descriptions are much shorter, and some of the sites don't actually have a real physical address, so it's just a Latin long on there. But this is pretty much what a finished site looks like on the website. So this is a screenshot of the back end. This is the page that I edit, and it's pretty simple. It's just name, description, location, and it will generate a blue dot on the website. And this is a screenshot of another part of the back end. So this is the name, site, location, description, and then able to upload images. And one of the things that is important about Lost Arkansas is that it can be ever changing, ever evolving. So it's very easy to go in and change wording, change images, add different locations, because if it's like a statue and it gets moved somewhere, you can change the location of it. So the website is ever evolving. So this is a screenshot of 3 sites in Helena, and these points of interest or sites are connected to one museum system that has multiple sites. So one of the features that will be happening soon, it's not able yet, is clicking on one system, and seeing the other points of interest that are associated with that. And so it turns more into a virtual exhibit than just going out and viewing these sites. And the same goes for sites like Hot Springs National Park that has a lot of bathhouses connected with it and different historic sites around it. It'll be similar to this, where you can click on one site and see all the sites that are connected with it. So the future plans for the website, eventually I am going to gather more historical images from the Arkansas State Archives to add to the site that do not already have images, or sites that have not been uploaded yet. I plan on adding digitized documents associated with a site, such as primary source PDFs, and continuing the process of finding and adding new sites to the website. I currently have a small list going, and I'm always finding more sites as I drive through Arkansas. My long-term goal is to create a mobile app for easy access when offline. If anybody that has driven through Arkansas knows how easy it is to lose cell service. So having a website or having an app that you can map out a route or a location on the phone will make it much easier than accessing the website from the phone, although the website is capable of being accessed by a phone. Yeah, my website is historytour.us. Please stop by and explore it. Thank you. Again, my name is Jamie Sloan, and my email is jamie@sloan.cc.
Thank you so much, Jamie. That is some really interesting information. Okay, so we're going to move into our Q&A session, and we're going to get the rest of the other three presenters from this session to come up. Second on that. Oh, all right, here we all are. All right, so Jamie, we're going to start with you. Just jump right in there. Are you taking submissions for historical sites to include on the Lost Arkansas website?
Yes, any sites that you would like added on there, you can just shoot me an email with a list of them, and I will be happy to add them.
What? How do you decide, Jamie, this is another one for you. How do you decide which areas to highlight on the map?
So I'm doing all of Arkansas, but the points that are currently on there are just ones that I have found so far. And so one area is not actually highlighted, if that makes sense. Or like, oh, so like some sites seem like they have more of an emphasis because there's just more historic sites like Little Rock.
Let's see. Oh, and another follow-up for you, Jamie. Are there any concerns with releasing geospatial data that is technically protected by the National Historical and Archaeological Preservation Act? Do we not want people going out to certain places, I guess, is the idea behind
So
that?
the only sites that I'm including are sites that I can find open source information about it, meaning that I am allowed to use it. And anything like the pictures or images from the archives, I've been getting permission to be able to use them. So I'm trying to be careful about that.
Grab another one. Someone was having trouble accessing Jamie's site, so we'll pass that information on. Do you guys have questions for each other? You got to see each other's presentations, and we've got any conversation among our presenters while we wait for the audience to weigh in? So if you could be sure to send your questions down to that Q&A box. I will, since we're slow on questions, I will read them out of the chat, but we can run them through Q&A. That way they're coming to one place just for me to read them. In regard to regarding Iron Forks, I missed a portion of the presentation. Is the rec area related? And has
Is
Don
the recreation area related to that? No, actually, well, outside of being in the same drainage, it's not. The Irons Fork is actually further upstream. The experimental forest is further up the watershed near the headwaters of there, and the recreational area is much closer to Mena. There's a reservoir, a fishing lake there, and boat launch and stuff like that, but they're not particularly close to each other.
Oh, Don, have you presented your work to anyone else? It's fascinating stuff. This is from Kristen.
So there's a little entry in the Encyclopedia of Arkansas now on the Irons Fork that has maybe a little bit more detail. And I've got one article in the field notes of the Arkansas Archaeological Society on the administrative site, and I'm preparing another one on the various weirs. Hopefully, eventually, I'll get something for the quarterly on the whole progress, but it's been kind of a slow process, let's put it that way.
And Malin was curious about it bumped up on me. How remote is the Iron Forks area? In what county is it located?
So Irons Fork, the former experimental forest, is mostly in kind of northeastern Polk County, a little bit of it in southeastern Scott County. That Odin's Iron Fork truck trail is still a road there. You can drive it. It helps to have a good high clearance vehicle to get through there. It's very visible along the road there, where you, if you know where to look. So it's still accessible. It's not the easiest thing to get to, but you can still get to it. It's public lands, federal land, so you can use it recreationally. Just don't vandalize any of the sites, or walk off with any of the artifacts, and it'll be good.
Dale, I have a question for you. Do you know if there were a lot of Native Americans in Oklahoma that were receiving federal aid throughout the Civil War just because of the disruption? Do you think that had any effect on how they were viewed and maybe treated in the Reconstruction era and that new relationship with the federal government?
Are you talking about aid after the war? Because during the war, they were cut off. During the war, they were very much cut off. And they tried to get aid to them through Kansas, and had great difficulty doing that, which was part of the reason they were trying to reoccupy Fort Gibson, is to bring supplies and bring a lot of that aid back into Indian Territory. And a part of my book, I don't know how many of our attendees are familiar with the name Stand Watie. He's another personality of the Cherokee. Stand Watie was very, very active in resisting that movement of trying to get the federal government back into Indian Territory. Whether he was doing that as part of the Civil War or absolutely against John Ross and the government is difficult to tell. But during the war, there was just great devastation. There was no supplies coming in, so it was hardship, very much.
If you could pop in, there's a question from Malin. He wants to know when OU is going to be finishing your book, getting it out.
We're kind of talking through the reviewer comments and suggestions and maybe additions, and we'll work in that hopefully within the next year or so.
Dawn, Patty wants to know, have you studied any of the forest regions and deforestations of Northeast Arkansas?
The work I do covers various parts in the state of Arkansas. Most of what we do are in more of the upland pine dominated systems, but I do some work in some of the bottomland hardwood areas. So I guess it depends on what you define Northeast Arkansas to be. I've done some historical reference work type things that would tie into Northeastern Arkansas. But specifically, most of the work gets done in just because of the nature of my research unit. It's more of the piney woods ecosystems.
And speaking of the trees, we have a question from Kristen. Are there trees from the experimental time? Are they still there, or is it all new growth?
Most of the trees that are there are relatively new. I mean, I guess it depends on what you're defining as new growth. They did cut in there after the forest, while it was an active experimental forest and after it was closed or disestablished. So there's some newer trees there, but there are definitely quite a few trees that date back a couple hundred years or further. And so that, the experimental forest itself is only, no more than 85 or 90 years old, depending on when you started it out. And so there's quite a few trees that predate the experimental forest itself there.
Hang on, I'm checking a bit on our time. So, a question from Dr. Dugan. With regard to the previous presentations, would the presenters suggest ASU closing its archives and turn the material over to another home? Not sure who that might be directed at. But I bet my ASU people might have an opinion. Anyone want to weigh in? Nope. All right. our conference host is fascinated by old growth trees that are found submerged in water and can then be milled for use. Do you know of any places in Arkansas where this type of wood has been?
Well, actually, I do. I'm probably not quite at liberty to say because there are commercial interests tied in with some of that, as you could imagine. But for example, there are places where there are what they call sinker cypress logs, where the cypress would actually sink into the river and or body of water and preserve there for a long time and then be pulled out. And there's places where you could get some pine for that. And probably just about every major river would have some of those kind of locations on them where if you know where to look and how to extract it, you can certainly access that kind of material still.
Well, it looks like we are out of questions. Here. If anyone has questions, they can definitely direct them to our presenters. Their contact information is available on the program. And we will go ahead and start our break a little bit early. Oh, let me make sure. And yep, we'll do that. And we'll see you back for the last 3 presentations of the afternoon. Of course, stick around after that for question and answer and some of our events this evening. So we'll see you back in a bit.
Captain Charles Narkinski, the son of Sam and Rebecca Narkinski of Little Rock, died of influenza at Luxembourg on December 9, 1918. Several images of Narkinski in his uniform, standing by the family's home at 515 Rock Street, are found in Series 10 of the Carolyn LeMaster Arkansas Jewish History Collection. In addition to showing Charles as a student and as a soldier, this amazing collection, made up of nearly 800 2.5 by 4.5 black and white negatives, tells the story of the whole Narkinski family from their arrival in Little Rock in about 1890 through the Second World War. These negatives, along with the rest of the Arkansas Jewish History Collection, can be seen at Cal's Butler Center for Arkansas Studies.
Dr. Fred T. Jones Sr., a graduate of Meharry Medical College, dedicated his life to providing insurance and medical care to African Americans in Arkansas and Louisiana through a combination of physical hospitals and fraternal organizations. While the hospitals served cities in central Arkansas, the fraternal societies served thousands more. Much of the Dr. Fred T. Jones collection, donated to the Cal's Butler Center for Arkansas Studies by his daughter Myrtle, has been digitized and is available online.
In February 1921, Governor McRae appointed Laura Connor of Woodruff County to the newly formed Honorary Penitentiary Commission. Replacing the previous salaried commission, this volunteer group was tasked with improving the financial condition of the state's prison system. Connor, the only woman on the commission, surprised everyone by raising the alarm about inhumane conditions. Her outspokenness, unusual for women of that day, especially Southern women, raised issues that the government apparently had no intention of dealing with. The material contained in the Laura Cornelius Connor papers tells the story of the hornet's nest her work stirred up. This collection is available both at the Cal's Butler Center for Arkansas Studies and online.
Hi, everyone. My name is Devin Sorrows, and I'm speaking to you as the Vice President and Ambassador of the Central Arkansas chapter of the Arkansas Archaeological Society. I'd like to let everyone know that as we continue to inch back into normal life, that our chapter will start to host a few more physically distanced events in the near future. To find out more about these events, be sure to check us out on Facebook. Of course, everything we plan will be completely in line with the recommendations of the CDC. I hope to see you all soon in person, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks.
I'm the curator, Drew Ulrich, and today I'd like to present our new traveling exhibition from the Smithsonian, Patios, Pools, and the Invention of the American Backyard. The panels we have chronicle the evolution of backyards within our nation from the end of World War II to essentially the present. We also have within it several artifacts pertaining to the enjoyment of backyards and a wonderful audiovisual presentation presenting different backyards found throughout the Delta region. We hope you will come and see it. It will run until October 2nd.
Hi, my name is Danielle Hausnick. I'm the Executive Director of Main Street Russellville. We are a downtown revitalization nonprofit organization, and we are located in the historic Russellville Train Depot, which is over 100 years old. Preserving downtown is very important to us, and we're so thankful for the organizations that make it possible. We hope to host Arkansas History Association down here in our historic downtown Russellville someday in the near future. Thanks!
All right, everyone, we are back for our last session of the afternoon. And I want to remind you, if you're just coming in with us, that we have some options over here on the side for you to be aware of. There's the event chat button. It looks like a little talking bubble in a cartoon. That's for you to talk to other presenters or other participants. And it's public. It goes to everybody. You can compliment our wonderful presenters. And then down at the bottom, we have the Q&A box, and that's where you should send any questions for the presenters. After all three people have spoken, we'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A, and that's where you should send your questions. I'm not going to look at the event chat this time because it got a little confusing, so be sure to use that Q&A, and our presenters will be able to see it, and then they'll be able to type in some answers too if maybe we don't get to this question. So. Now, our first presenter for this last session of the afternoon is Lisa Childs. She's working on her master's in history at the University of Arkansas. She has a JD from Loyola University, Chicago, and a PhD in genetics from North Carolina State University, and she's a patent attorney. Her current work focuses on kinship and community formation at the turn of the last century in the foothills of the Ouachita Mountains. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Childs.
Thanks, Becky. So today I'm going to talk about women homesteaders in the foothills of the Ouachita Mountains. This image is taken from a patent, the legal document granting title to a successful homesteader under the 1862. This act was to encourage what the law called actual settlement and cultivation. The settler could get up to 160 acres per household if they paid about $14 in government fees and lived on the land for 5 years. As you can see, the federal government has always seen women as having an integral role in a homesteading family. She's not just responsible for settlement, for taking care of that fine house in the background, but also for cultivation. But what happens when the woman is the head of the homesteading family? That's what I focus on today. Sarah Thomas illustrates many of the features of these homesteading women. In July 1898, just 6 months after her husband Barnard died, Sarah Thomas filed her homestead claim for 160 acres in the foothills of the Ouachita Mountains. They had moved there from Texas in 1883 and successfully homesteaded 160 acres before Barnard and their 14-year-old son died of typhoid. She was left with a life estate in their land, assessed at $300, the prospect of a pension for his Mexican War service at $6 a month, 5 children, about $100 in animals, including a mare, which was soon to die, and $100 in doctor bills. When the Pension Bureau asked her why she didn't just rent out her land, she wrote back, "The land in this country is too poor to rent. We had no money to help. You ask what kind of work I do. I plow or do anything else on the farm except making rails. I know how to farm." The Kansas City Southern Railroad and sawmills newly come to the area. 3/4 of the nearby land had not yet been claimed. Why would anyone rent land they could get for nearly free? So historians have largely ignored the federal government's transfer of nearly 1/4 of Arkansas's land to private use after the Homestead Act of 1862 and after Arkansas rejoined the Union. Today, I'll focus on one aspect of that transfer: women in an area in the Ouachita foothills which was nearly entirely settled after the Civil War, indeed mostly after the Kansas City Southern's arrival in 1896. This area stretches from the Oklahoma border on the west, on past Umpire to the east, to the borders of Howard and Polk counties running north-south. It's a good bit south of Mena. I argue that the land became choice, to use Robert Walls's word, because railroads made already farmable lands accessible. We usually think of homesteaders going west to conquer new lands. This is not what we see in the Ouachitas. Ouachita women homesteaded within their kinship communities. In contrast to homesteading women further west, women in the Ouachitas, like Sarah Thomas, had ties to the area. They already knew how to farm. For this study, I collected Bureau of Land Management information on all patentees in this region, and I identified 156 women homesteaders, or about 11% of all homesteaders, and used 10% of homesteading men for comparison. Best I can tell, practically all homesteaders in this region were white. I worked with 106 full homestead files, including those of 40 women, from this area and nearby. The next slides are full of data, but I'd like you to focus on the trends. About 1/3 of these homesteaders, male or female, were born in Arkansas, more than any other state. Around 40% came from elsewhere in the Southeast besides Arkansas. Women acquired land, shown on the left, at a rate similar to the rate of land acquisition overall. That slide showed acres transferred. This slide shows the number of patents. The orange line is the number granted to men, and the blue bars show those granted to women. The scale is different. Many more patents were granted to men than women, but the timing is similar for men and women. Both men and women got fewer patents during the 1893 panic. Both got more patents about 5 years after the Kansas City Southern came to the area in 1896. This is complicated. The point of this slide and the next one is that most homesteaders were married at the time of grant. Nearly 3/4 of all homesteaders were married men, and as we see on the next slide, more than half of all women acquiring land had been married before they acquired that land. Nearly 20% were married when they obtained land. 14% were and remained single, as compared to 3% of men. This suggests that women were necessary to successfully homestead in the Ouachita foothills. Now, Ouachita homesteaders had mostly lived on the area much longer than the 5 years required to obtain a homestead. Thus, they knew how to farm. Their median time in the area before grant was 12 years for men and 22 years for women. Women tended to be older than men at the time they got their patents. Women's median age at grant was 46, and men were 8 years younger, 38. Now, these differences make sense, right? Women only got patents if they were the head of household. You mostly only farm as a family unit, so women would mostly be older widows, while men would be filing on land that they can farm with their wives and children. This area was not terribly accessible until the railroads came in. Farmers wanted good land and good transportation, so homesteading applications accelerated when the trains came. So did the number of farms and people in Polk and Howard counties, peaking in about 1910. A difference, but one you can't see without looking at the applications, is the problem of aloneness. Women repeatedly told the federal government during the application process that they could not live alone. The government even provided for women who became widowed during the homesteading process. They could continue farming, or they could get somebody else to farm for them and yet still get the land. Washita women did both. Some women even did this in turn. Mary Jane Brock was a single woman and the first of several Brock women I'll mention today. She settled on her land in 1899 and filed her claim in 1901, but she had trouble finding someone to stay with her. In 1905, she boarded away with family because, quote, she could not stay at home alone. Tranny Stewart Myers' first proof was canceled, quote, because of my not making my home all the time on same. I endeavored to comply with what I thought was the law and kept my household effects on the entry all the time. And what time I was absent, I was forced to be because of the fact that I am single. Sarah Thomas's son Barney likewise needed to stay with his mother. He did not settle on his land promptly after filing because he was, quote, living on an adjoining farm with my mother, who was a widow, and as it would have been inconvenient for her to move at that time, I didn't wish to leave her alone. Newly widowed women could leave the land, and some did. In 1902, Mary Forgey had, quote, no one now except myself, husband and only child dead. Since I had no one to live with me, I lived with my parents nearby and kept the place in repair and cultivation. Emma Baggett Hurley started out homesteading as Elisha Baggett's wife. Elisha died in April 1900. Emma moved in with her father. She then married Robert Hurley in August 1902 and returned to her homestead. Emma and Robert disagreed, and she became a deserted widow that November, when, quote, she again went back to her father's. She being alone with only a small child, it was not considered safe for her to reside on place. Emma explained, we disagreed, and I went back to my father's house, did not consider it safe to live alone. 6 months later, Emma gave birth. Emma and Robert later reconciled, and she had 5 more children with him. Recently widowed women often filed a claim within a few months of their husband's death. Some sought a place of their own. Some sought land that they had been squatting on with their husbands. Others moved near their birth family. Julia Butcher's husband died in February 1882, and she settled on new land that December. Cynthia Atterbury's second husband died in September 1894, and she filed her claim that October on land they had settled together nearly 6 years earlier. In 1895, about 6 months after her husband, a U.S. deputy marshal, was killed while sitting on their gallery, Amanda Martin filed on land they had settled together. Sarah Thomas, as we have seen, filed on new land 6 months after her husband died in 1898. Now that a new husband had previously obtained a homestead or chose to seek one later did not necessarily raise legal barriers to a woman homesteading. The timing of a woman filing her claim and obtaining a marriage license were key. Land must come before marriage. In August 1895, just 2 weeks before they married, Sarah Brock traveled with her future husband, Turner Duckett, from North Howard County to the land office in Camden to file her claim. Turner had exhausted his homestead right 20 years earlier in Sebastian County and had been squatting on land in Northwest Howard County ever since. Sarah was free to claim land so long as she filed before marriage. Harriet Stewart Choate also filed on the eve of marriage, and her husband also obtained a homestead, but his came 7 years later. Other women also filed shortly before marriage, but their husbands seem not to have obtained their own land. Not all homesteaders who filed as single women and later married appeared to have marriage on their minds when they filed. At least 8 Washita women delayed marriage by 2 years or more after filing. 6 of these women were of childbearing age when they filed, suggesting they may have seen homesteading as providing choices other than marriage and the baby carriage that usually followed. One of our alone women, Mary Jane Brock, didn't marry for 7 years after she filed, when she was 33. One last set of homesteading experiences, spanning 2 decades, illustrates the challenges of being a single woman as well as the benefits of being part of a family who knew how to farm. In 1882, near present-day Vandervoort, the Brock sisters, Cindy and Amelia, and their bachelor brother Lawrence filed adjoining homestead claims. Cindy claimed the land that their parents had settled on 5 years earlier, including the house her father and brother built. She had no trouble proving it up in 1889, even though she had, quote, no family of my own, but lived with my brother and sister. At the same time, Amelia conceded that she, quote, never did actually live on my claim, but lived with my sister, being single and unmarried. Having no family, I have lived with my sister, but visited my improvements and was on my claim almost daily from the date of settlement to the present time. For being a lone woman, I could not conveniently live on my. She cultivated 16 acres and settled just 25 yards off the claim, but that didn't meet the law's requirements of settling on the land. So in 1892, she built a house on her claim. In 1898, she finally got her patent, 21 years after her family settled on Cindy's land and 16 years after she claimed her own. I'd like to close this with my great Aunt Blanche's recollections about these homesteading Brock sisters, her own great aunts. My great-grandmother, Eliza Brock Turrentine, was Aunt Blanche's mother and the Brock sisters' niece. In 1974, 65 years after the Brock sisters died in 1909, Aunt Blanche remembered how her mother, quote, admired their appearance, for they were always dressed in the mode when they went out. Mama said, most people would make a Sunday dress and wear it for years, but the two spinster aunts made a new Sunday dress each year and took the old Sunday dress for every day. Aunt Blanche went on to recall, Mama also took pride in the maiden aunts being well read for their day and time. She mentioned a neighbor man who enjoyed arguing politics, but the aunts could down him in an argument. They subscribed for a newspaper, not a local one, and apparently read it with understanding. Having a couple of sections of land gave them some freedom. Washita women and men needed extended family because farming involved a family-based labor system. They chose to homestead at home. Like Washita men, more women homesteaded when the trains came, making the land more desirable because more accessible. Owning land made it easier for women to choose when and whether to marry and to obtain homes of their own within their community, where they already knew how to farm. Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I really understand why that won the Susie Pryor last year. That is some interesting information. Thank you. Next up, we have Dr. Linda Jones. She's an associate professor of language area studies at the University of Arkansas and received her PhD from the University of New Mexico. Dr. Jones teaches courses on French colonial Mississippi history, Native American and French language encounters, and language teaching in video and web-based technologies. Please join me in welcoming our second Dr. Jones of the day.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that introduction. Today I'm going to be talking to you about 17th century Arkansas communicated. Let me begin. Jacques Marquette and Louis Joliet made their way to a Quapaw village in July of 1673. Marquette was given a calumet by the Illinois to serve as a, quote, safeguard for their passage through the hostile nations farther down the river, end quote. Soon he experienced firsthand its ability to speak peace. After leaving the Illinois, Marquette and Joliet were attacked by the Michigameas at the St. Francis River. By, quote, displaying the calumet which the Illinois gave them, end quote, they went unharmed. Not long after, Marquette and Joliet met the Quapaw for the first time. As the Arkansas Indians came towards them in two canoes, the leader of the first canoe stood up, held forth the calumet, and, quote, made various signs according to the custom of the country, end quote. Soon after, the Quapaw moved towards the village, quote, making us a sign to follow them slowly, end quote. Once in the village, an Illinois man helped the two cultures interact with each other. The day that Marquette and Joliet met the Quapaw, direct comprehension was not in store. Marquette attempted to speak their language, but found it, quote, exceedingly difficult, and I could succeed in pronouncing only a few words, notwithstanding all my efforts, end quote. Likely, the Quapaw had trouble pronouncing French as well. Rather than speaking directly to each other, one relied on interpreters when available. More consistently, quote, speaking, end quote, relied on nonverbal communication, sign and body language, languages of ceremony and reciprocity, gestures of hospitality. Language was indisputably spoken, and its many verbal and nonverbal iterations directly impacted encounters, interactions, and alliances between the French, the Quapaw, and the Caddos in 17th century Arkansas. So the question is, what does it mean to communicate? Well, communication is the act of developing meaning among entities or groups through the use of sufficiently mutually understood signs, symbols, and semiotic conventions. And so in the case of the French, the Quapaw, and the Caddo, signs, body language, gestures, drawings, maps, rituals, and objects and actions all played a part in communication. Let me give you a couple of the other examples. Here we go. Okay. Traveling in two canoes, Sieur de La Salle and Henri de Tonty and their men arrived outside of the Quapaw village on March morning in 1682. The Sakue, or war cries, came from the village, which was, quote, disturbed by such an unanticipated visit, end quote. The men were certain that, quote, the Arkansas believed that these were their enemies, end quote, who were approaching. For the Quapaw, quote, sent away their women and children, end quote. Alarmed by the Quapaw nonverbal response, the Frenchmen quickly moved to the other side of the river and hastily built a fortress. The Tonty, quote, walked out to a point, and there I discovered the village, and I asked them in Illinois who they were. And Illinois among them cried out, Akansa. And he asked me who I was. I responded to him, Miskiguchia, which is the name that the Southern Native people give us, end quote. Some within La Salle's party further cried out, Nikana, the Illinois word for friend. Unsatisfied by this verbal exchange, the Quapaw shot an arrow towards the French. Quote, if one had shot back, this would have been a sign that one demanded war. But seeing that we did not shoot back, they went to their village to announce that we were peaceful, end quote. Shortly thereafter, Kapaha, chief of the burg, along with 6 of his principal people, arrived with the calumet. The Quapaw, quote, entered our fortress and presented the calumet to Monsieur de La Salle and all the others to smoke, also making the sign that one go to their village, end quote. Oops, sorry, there we go. Here is another example. Just after Christmas Day, 1698, missionaries from the Seminaire de Quebec made their way to a Quapaw village. Quote, seeing several wooden canoes along the riverbank and a Quapaw standing next to them, one of the Frenchmen quickly grabbed a calumet and began to sing out of fear the Quapaw would flee once he saw us. Hearing his loud voice in the nearby village, some fled, while several Quapaw came to the water's edge, calumet in hand. They approached us and rubbed our bodies and then themselves, a mark of esteem among their culture. They then lifted us onto their shoulders and carried us to the chief's cabin, end quote. Well, in these particular scenarios, we see that information was communicated. In these first encounters, rich, nonverbal conversation took place. Anxious reactions such as fleeing or hastily building a fortress communicated fear. Shooting an arrow enunciated a question. Hey, do you come in peace or war? Silence uttered the answer. We come in peace. Physical contact projected feelings of esteem. Let us carry you to the village to show that we value your presence. Allow us to caress you and then ourselves so that your spirit can become one with ours. But what was communicated through the calumet proved the most consequential of all. While the French believed the calumet provided friendship, safe passage, and trade relations, for the Quapaw, the calumet helped secure, quote, balance, order, and unity, end quote, in their society, and, quote, extended this principle to relations with outsiders through the creation of fictive or ancillary kinship relations, end quote. Thus, the calumet communicated, quote, a framework for peace, alliance, exchange, and free movement, end quote. There we go. Balance, order, and unity were communicated through every aspect of Quapaw society. The Quapaw communicated their social makeup through the manner in which they stood, quote, having around us the elders who were nearest to us, after them the warriors, and finally all the common people in the crowd, including the women and children, end quote. In first encounters, the Quapaw often approached their unknown guests with 6 men in a canoe, likely representative of the two people of Quapaw society, the Sky people, who maintained the spiritual properties of their culture, and the Earth people, who had oversight of hunting and fishing, agriculture, and war. During the calumet ceremony, balance was also communicated, quote, they brought out 2 calumet with feathers of all colors. Chiefs and warriors had gourds filled with pebbles along with 2 drums. Utilizing these skins that cover these instruments, quote, the first ones began a song that they accompanied with a peal of their gourd rattles. These having finished, others began the same thing. Then those who had accomplished heroic actions utilized a club to strike a post erected in the middle of the plaza. If anyone who struck the pole lied, then the one who knew it would go to the pole with the skin to clean it off and to say that they had lied. Ultimately, the calumet ceremony obliged the stranger to equally engage in reciprocity, to share in the smoking of the calumet, to strike the pole, and to exchange gifts so as to develop alliance and kinship with the Quapaw. All was carefully choreographed, balanced, and non-verbally communicated as a result. Okay, so when we talk about these interactions, we can also talk about Henri Joutel. I've not mentioned him just yet. Henri Joutel was with La Salle and witnessed La Salle's murder in 1687. Well, as Henri Joutel made his way east towards the Quapaw, he first went through the Caddo region. And there, he was welcomed by the Caddo elders on his path to the village. He was carried into the village. He was washed and seated on an elevated platform. Gifts were exchanged, and he too, like the seminary priests among Quapaw, was caressed as a way of sharing the spirit of the two different cultures. But Joutel also made his way east towards the Quapaw. And there, once among the Quapaw, he witnessed the hospitality of tremendous feasts. Quote, we would have had in truth need for several stomachs, since they were sometimes 4 or 5 waiting on us to take us each to their cabin. But even though we did not need all this food, we continued to go so as to not dismiss them and indeed to please them, end quote. Well, this is an example of communicating goodwill, and this was a part of communication in the 17th century. Jean Cavalier, who traveled with Joutel in 1687, also had his own experience of trying to communicate goodwill to the Caddo. For when he was with the Caddo, he, quote, grew tired of them singing out and to be exposed to the heat of the sun, end quote. But understanding that participation communicated goodwill, Cavalier placed his nephew in his place. Quote, they said this was fine, and they continued, end quote. When the seminary missionaries encountered the Quapaw in 1698, they too had to communicate goodwill. Quote, it is necessary to participate if one does not want to come across as having a bad heart or bad designs. We put our men in our place after a while, and they had the pleasure of being rocked all night, end quote. Father Sancombe added to that, quote, someone had to participate or the alliance would simply not stand, end quote. There we go. Another way of communicating was gifts through words. In other words, a gift, as Father Lejeune called it, was quote, called the word, in order to make clear that it is the present, the gift, which speaks more forcibly than the lips, end quote. So when Father Joutel, he wasn't a father, when Andre Joutel went through the Quapaw region, he needed the Quapaw to help him travel to the Illinois region. So he recruited Quapaw from the 4 villages to help travel with him from the Quapaw villages to the Illinois. So he had to give gifts that served as words of thanks. Quote, we took care to compensate the Quapaw who had guided us to the fort among the Illinois. We gave each a gun, 2 hatchets, some knives, powder and balls, and other trifles. One Quapaw had earlier died, and we gave the dead man companions the promised gun and other things that were to be given to him so that they could give them to the village he was from, or they could give him to the parents, end quote. So communication was not just verbal or gift-oriented or whatever. It also entailed signs, mapping in signs, in fact. Signs such as follow us to the village, follow us slowly to the village. Here are the locations of our 4 different villages, okay? But this also entailed mapping. This particular map on the right, which you don't see the whole thing, but it's an important map, was done in 1699. This was created by the French missionaries from the Seminaire de Quebec. Likely, this particular map was actually drawn by the Quapaw, drawn by somebody on the Mississippi. I can't really attribute it to the Quapaw, but drawn by someone on the Mississippi and then filled in by the French to say, here are the locations of the villages. So communicating location as a result in that instance. Okay. Other ways of communicating included adopted communication. For example, gunshots. When we talk about gunshots, in 1687, Joutel was welcomed into the Quapaw village through gunshots. When Joutel was leaving the Quapaw, he was saluted with gunshots. When Joutel arrived among the Illinois, he was welcomed with gunshots. And these were gunshots done by the Quapaw and the Illinois. These were not done by the French. And this is important because this represents an adoption of a typical French source of communication that therefore was embraced and utilized by the Quapaw and the Illinois as a result. Okay? I have so much more that I could say, but I'm limited in my time. And so I want to say that we can still talk about the lack of dictionaries and word lists in this region. We can talk about the communication of religion, the miscommunication that took place, the deceptive communication that took place, pidgins and jargons and interpreters, and so on. But to get to the crust of this last slide, let me say that languages were spoken, verbally and non-verbally. The Quapaw heard missionaries chant in Latin, for example. Likely the French heard the Quapaw use a different language for their spirit's world. And of course, one heard French Quapaw Caddo in Illinois. And by the end of the century, one likely heard Mobilian jargon, which provided the absolute minimum of vocabulary necessary to carry on the basic activities of interest, especially trade. Despite these varied modes of communication, we are hard-pressed to find any measure of French or native words directly exchanged in 17th century Arkansas. Nonetheless, the Quapaw, Caddo, and French communicated through ceremonies, rituals, body language, signs and gestures, emotions, salutations, and exchanges and trust. Though through nonverbal and verbal interaction, 17th century Arkansas communication operated at the level of meaning, though often interpreted based on how one deciphered what one experienced. There you go.
Thank you so much, Linda. That was really fascinating. I would like to remind everybody that if you have a question, you need to use the Q&A box, not the event chat, and we'll catch up with those after our next and last presenter of the day, Mr. Liam McMahon. He's a Northwest Arkansas native who received his BA in history from the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville. He's currently employed as acting, game, and sound design lead at the Tesseract Center for Game Design. Please join me in welcoming Mr. McMahon.
Thanks, Rebecca. Howdy, folks. This presentation arose from my interest in the limits of collective memory and the processes by which it decays when there is no one left to maintain it. Thus, my focus on litter through the ages, those objects that human beings abandoned to forget. I found every object in the following video within a few miles of my home in the northern part of Crawford County, set among the woods and roads of the Ozark St. Francis National Forest, itself here set among the ruins of a 19th century village known variously as London Town, Eads, or Rosedale, depending on which member of the Masonic Lodge you ask. With their hamlet itself set among the hills and streams of territory briefly and imperiously set aside for the displaced Cherokee by America's early 19th century white administrators, following the removal of the Osage, who were themselves the latest in a long line of indigenous denizens of these verdant valleys for generations stretching back into the fathoms of the past. In creating this video, I found that conventional historical inquiry, while useful for establishing different contexts for individual items, was more apt to reveal further holes in collective memory as it concerns this particular valley. Crawford County's white chroniclers, like Clara Eno or Edward Briscoe, tended to minimize or omit entirely the roles played by black and indigenous dwellers of the valley. Federal law imposes its own limits. The Forest Service keeps an internal map of sites of archaeological and historical interest in the valley, but the National Acts of Historical and Archaeological Preservation exempt this map from disclosure under the Freedom of Information Act, an exemption that I am personally in agreement with, though at this time my appeal to the Forest Service for an overriding exception has not been processed. So, what I present to y'all today are some of the sounds and sights of collective memories in decay. When witnessed all together, they tell a tale in ruins of the different relationships human beings have had with this particular place. Arrowheads, old rock walls, and too many beer cans to count tell a centuries-long story of use for hunting, agricultural cultivation, and recreation. Every single one of the objects you are about to see has a story. Together they constitute a rich, interwoven tapestry of human works and ecological processes, international in scope and intimately local in manifestation, literally just lying around in plain view of those who care to tarry a moment and ask, now just how did that get there? Well, let's take a look.
In most parts of North America, the archaeologist finds himself at great disadvantage when he attempts to reconstruct, in the absence of written records, the culture of a vanished people. Their language, their social and political systems, their religion, their heritage of song and story are completely lost. Only from material artifacts, the implements, the clothing, the weapons they used, can the investigator hope to gain some knowledge of their life. And even in this he is handicapped, for, in the majority of cases, 9/10 of the products made by the people whose handiwork he wishes to study have disappeared as completely as their language and their religion. Gone, in many areas, are the wood, the bark, the basketry, the vegetal fibers, the gourds, the skin and furs and feathers they used, all long perished through the agencies of decay. The few objects remaining are only such as happened to have been made of durable materials. From The Ozark Bluff Dwellers by Mark R. Harrington, published 1960. Before the creation of the Ozark National Forest soon after 1933, farms were tilled, and homes were kept in this valley, and it had been so, at least for 80 years. The loss of many county records in the Van Buren Courthouse fire of March 23, 1877, balks research beyond that date. The United States Forestry Service, in order to carry out its purposes, removed or burned all houses, barns, fences, and small bridges. Fields became thickets and stands of second-growth timber. Wells were filled, roadways abandoned, and many springs reverted to half-hidden seeps of murky water. The face of the land changed unnaturally. More years yet will be needed to erase the last marks of civilized occupation and restore to the district the primeval newness it once possessed before the white man came. From London Town, 1893, by Edward Eugene Briscoe. Published in the Heritage, official publication of the Crawford County Historical Society, October 1959. The historical record of the years 1541 to 1850 is a litany of disease, death, despair, and displacement of people. The splendid cultures that had occupied Arkansas for so long, the Caddo, the Quapaw, the Tunica, and the Osage, were declining rapidly and were being moved west by the settlers. The Osage left in 1807, the Quapaw in 1833, and the Caddo in 1835, while the Tunicans seemed to have moved south into Louisiana without anyone noticing when. Meanwhile, other tribes from farther east were being pushed into Arkansas temporarily: Cherokees, Choctaws, Usadas, Shawnees, and Delawares. No Indian tribe holds territory in Arkansas today, but the traces of their long occupation, their campsites, their villages and towns, their monuments, their tools and weapons, their works of art, and their graves are everywhere. From Crossroads of the Past, 12,000 Years of Indian Life in Arkansas, by Frank Schambach and Leslie Newell, published 1990.
I was just talking the other day with siblings trying to remember some trash dumps in the Ozarks that have down in hollers that have been buried. So we're going to head into our last question and answer session. And so if you can put your questions in the Q&A box. I'm not going to check the chat this time because it got a little distracting the last time. And oh, it looks like we've got everybody on. Okay. So it looks like our first question is for Lisa, and it's from Dr. Mitchell. Were language and communications? Oh, nope, it's for Linda. Hang on, I'm confused here. Okay, so let me back up. All right, yes, the first one is for Lisa. Are there many resources or narratives on the 14% of homesteading women who were single and remained single? Similarly, how successful were widows in retaining and passing on their homesteads?
So, good questions. In Arkansas, no, there's very little. Mine seems to be almost the only work done on the 14% of women who were single and remained. Out west, there's a lot more like big women narratives about how cool it is that they took the train out and were independent. And the second question, Becky? Narratives about widows. Yeah. So also, when I went to the National Archives, I only looked at successful homesteading. I didn't look at the files of unsuccessful homesteaders. So I can't, and I also didn't, well, I take that back. I also looked at how long women who homesteaded stayed in the area, kind of writ large, Southwest Arkansas or Arkansas, I don't remember which, and many women stayed in the area. They may have sold their homestead to somebody else and and moved up or left it to their children, but they did stay. They homesteaded successfully, whether they were single women, widowed women, or marrying women. They still stayed to a somewhat greater extent than the men that I matched them up with. Might be because they were older on average, because I have noticed that you don't want to move away as much once you're settled in your community.
And how did you choose this particular region? Did you already know that there were a lot of women homesteaders there?
Well, so to start with, when I was in 3rd grade and reading Little House on the Prairie, my grandmother wrote to me about these Brock sisters and their brother, about how they had, the story that had come down was that they built one house where the 3 pieces of land intersected. And now we know from that's the memory is not exactly how it worked out. But so I had known about homesteading, and I had used homesteading files as resources for home family work. And then I was looking 2.5 years ago at amazing books of, Boyd has a series of books showing you who got land from the government. And I noticed that there were, and Sarah Brock Duckett, Turner Duckett is my grandfather's grandfather. She's a step, but also she's an aunt on my grandmother's side. And I noticed that there were a lot more women who changed their name in the homesteading process in that area. And I thought, well, that would be interesting to learn more about. So I went to the National Archives and collected more files about the women who changed their names and some of their siblings. And I don't know if this is an unusual in Arkansas. I would suspect it is not unusual. That if you go to later settled areas, that you're going to, and by settled I mean the time when you actually acquire land from the federal government, because they squatted there for quite a while, looks like, before they got around to claiming land. I suspect it would not be that strategy is not unique in the southern homestead public land states.
Linda, also from Brian, were language and communication skills merely gained by trial, error, and experience, or were there guides and training that the French crown or church provided to prospective explorers, traders, settlers?
Oh, that's a very good question. I think, especially in the case of La Salle and de Tonty, it was trial and error. But I will say that as time went on, the Jesuit missionaries in particular were really good at working with the native people and developing dictionaries and prayer books in order to communicate with the native people that they were among, in particular among the Illinois. But when it came to the Quapaw, no missionary, for example, stayed among the Quapaw long enough to create any form of a dictionary, much less a prayer book. And so, yes, it was trial and error, especially among the Quapaw. However, that is not to say that people did not develop language skills well enough to be able to communicate with the Quapaw. When Arkansas Post was created in 1686, Jean Couture and Charles Delaunay were 2 of the men who were at Arkansas Post, and they were known as men who were able to develop skills well enough that they could become interpreters at Arkansas Post. And then others subsequently became interpreters as well. Francois Saracen, who was the father of Saracen, the Quapaw chief, for example, is another one who became an interpreter. And Joseph Bunn in the 19th century served as a Quapaw interpreter as well. But back to the 17th century, it was pretty much trial and error in terms of who could develop the language skills necessary to verbally communicate with the Quapaw. Yep.
Thank you. Liam, I've got one for you. Trash pits and privies are often good archaeological finds because they provide intact artifacts that tell us about everyday life for a particular group of people. Do you think this litter will tell future archaeologists about us?
Oh, absolutely. I think, and I have a rough theory that I would need to actually do a broad-ranging survey on, but in terms of tracking, you can see the size of these cans, in addition to like the actual manufacturing of them around the top, and cans being especially interesting. But the design of the manufacturing on the top changes, and the average volume of them fluctuates as well over time, and I would be interested in tracking that along with, say, just how is the economy doing? Is there an economic depression or recession at the time? Is that affecting the general fluid ounce volume of your average can of alcohol at the time? And so I think that there's, and that's before you even get to, well, now you're driving out into the country to drink it and dispose of it. So I think that there are some interesting things in terms of the intersection of substance use and recreational land use to be explored further. Mostly a call for action there.
All right, so we've got a little less than 4 minutes left. We have a bunch of questions, so I'll ask you to be brief in your responses if you can. From Stephen, for Dr. Jones, is there any sense that the Quapaws had formed some preconceptions or expectations about the French based on European trade goods they might have acquired indirectly before their first direct contacts with the French?
Oh, wow. Can you rephrase that question for me?
Let me see if I can, yeah. So I believe that, were the Quapaw interacting with European goods before the French actually showed up, and did that set some expectations for them when the French did arrive?
Gosh, I don't know how to answer that question. One more time, ask me that question. I'm sorry, that's a tough one, yeah.
Yeah, so I would wonder if there were enough Europeans yet in North America for the Quapaw to have received European goods through trade before the French actually arrived. So
Okay.
I think that's what I'm getting at is.
Okay,
were
yeah.
there people
Yeah.
show up?
Sure, thank you. So 1673, that's when Marquette and Joly came along. That is the official time when the French met with the Quapaw. It is possible, we don't know, but it's possible that other Europeans encountered the Quapaw before that time, but it would be unofficial. And so, for example, in 1686, when we talk about the gunshots going off as a way of communicating salutation and greeting and farewell, did that happen before the French arrived? It's hard to say. And then for that matter, when did the Quapaw receive those guns? Because some will say the Quapaw didn't receive those guns until the English encountered the Quapaw, and the English actually encountered the Quapaw as a result of Jean Couture, who was the first French Arkansan, who essentially became an Arkansas turncoat. In other words, he left the French and became an Englishman or an English supporter as a result. So that's a tough question to answer, and so I want to be short here so others have a chance to respond. Yep.
Got two more for you. One person wants to know where the 1699 map is located.
Yep. The 1699. Sure. The 1699 map is located in the archives of the Seminaire de Quebec up in Quebec. The Quebec archives are actually a World Heritage Site. It's an incredible collection of archive material that includes maps and letters of the 17th century. And so that particular map, and there's another one, both are found in those archives, and they're both readily accessible to people who want to look at them. Yeah.
And looks like Liam popped out there to answer where to obtain his presentation, which is great. And one more for Linda. I lost it. Here it is. Do you feel that this communication was sincere or more of a means of self-preservation between the groups?
That's a good question. With Joutel, it almost seems sincere. Sometimes when you read these letters, you you get different impressions. For example, way back in the 16th century, when you read the letters of those who were the French who were among the Native Americans in the Florida region, 16th century, you felt like it was really an anthropological understanding of what was up. And so you really got a good feeling of they were observing and interpreting and receiving what they saw there. Joutel strikes me as someone who was relatively sincere, that he really wanted to do the right thing, that he really wanted to be sure and interpret to the Quapaw that he was sincere about thanking them, about giving them the honest reciprocal sort of a thing that was going on with the Quapaw. And so it seems like to me, especially with Joutel, that it was sincere. Now, I can't always say that about some others, but Joutel felt sincere to me. Yeah.
Sorry, our time is running out. So thank you, presenters. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I would like everyone to remember that the trivia is tonight at 6 p.m. And if anyone can make a remote reception entertaining and fun, it would be Ian Beard and Dr. Kelly Jones. So I strongly encourage you to log in and participate. Rachel sent you an email with a PDF explaining how the trivia is going to work, and it should be a lot of fun. So thank you so much for coming to our first day of a virtual conference. This has been wonderful. It's been so great to hear some Arkansas history again after so long. And please have a wonderful evening and see you at trivia. Thank you.